My friends, before words were invented, before styles were classified, before schools divided what should remain unified, there was simply the reality of human combat. Two beings in motion, each with intention, each with will, each seeking to express their truth in the most direct way possible. I come to you today not to add another flower to the garden of martial arts, already overgrown with exotic blooms that please the eye but bear little fruit. I come instead as a gardener with shears, ready to prune what is excessive, to cut away what is decorative but non-functional, to reveal the essential nature that lies beneath ornamentation. What I call Jeet Kune Do was born from frustration, both with traditional systems that trapped expression within rigid forms, and with modern approaches that collected techniques without unifying principles. I found myself standing between worlds, seeing value in all approaches yet constrained by each. The answer was not to create something new, but to rediscover something original, the unadorned truth of combat itself. The martial arts world speaks of lineage as something sacred, a pedigree to be preserved. But what is the oldest lineage? It is not a style passed from master to student over generations. It is the lineage written in your muscles, your reflexes, your instincts. The inheritance of our species that knew how to survive long before the first martial art was codified. Today I speak to you not as one who has transcended this inheritance, but as one who has remembered it. In Jeet Kune Do, we do not seek to overcome our nature, but to fulfill it. We do not aim to replace instinct with technique, but to refine instinct through understanding. I ask that you approach what I share today with both skepticism and openness, skeptical of any claim not verified by your experience, yet open to possibilities your training may have closed off. The greatest obstacle to discovery is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. When you believe you already understand, learning becomes impossible. Some seek martial arts as a path to domination of others. Some seek it as a collection of deadly secrets. Some seek it as a performance to impress onlookers. Jeet Kune Do offers none of these things. What it offers instead is liberation from artificial limitations, from dependency on fixed responses, from the prison of classical thought that tells you there is only one correct way to move, to strike, to be. Combat is not a static thing to be captured and preserved like an insect in amber. It is alive, dynamic, ever-changing, like the currents of a river that never passes the same bank twice. Our understanding must possess this same quality of aliveness, this same resistance to crystallization and dogma. What you will hear today is not a sermon to be accepted on faith, but a hypothesis to be tested through your own investigation. I offer not commandments, but observations, not doctrine, but direction, not a destination, but a compass to navigate your own journey. Let us begin with the name itself, Jeet Kune Do. For in these 3 words lies a revolution in thinking about martial arts that changes everything that follows. Jeet Kune Do. These 3 words contain the essence of my approach to martial arts, and indeed to life itself. Let me share with you what they truly mean, beyond the simple translation many of you might already know. In Cantonese, Jeet means to intercept or to stop. Kune refers to a fist, and Do signifies the way or the path. Together they form the way of the intercepting fist. But this translation alone does not reveal the profound philosophy embedded within these words. When I speak of interception, I am not merely describing a physical action where one stops an opponent's attack. I am speaking of a state of readiness that exists before combat even begins. A readiness not just of the body, but of the mind and spirit. To intercept truly means to arrive at the destination before the journey has even started. It means to resolve a conflict before it has fully formed. In traditional martial arts, practitioners are taught to block first, then counterattack in a sequence of separate movements. This approach divides what should be unified. In Jeet Kune Do, we intercept. We strike as the opponent commits to their attack, in that millisecond of vulnerability when their intention becomes action, but before their action reaches completion. We do not wait for the attack to arrive. We meet it on its journey. This principle of interception extends beyond physical technique into a philosophy of efficiency. Why travel the longer path when a direct route exists? Why use two movements when one will suffice? Why wait for problems to fully manifest when they can be addressed in their embryonic stage? The fist in Jeet Kune Do does not merely represent the closed hand as a weapon. It symbolizes focused energy, concentrated will, and unified purpose. A fist is individual fingers coming together as one. Similarly, in Jeet Kune Do, we unify what others separate: mind and body, technique and intuition, Eastern wisdom and Western science, ancient knowledge and modern discovery. As for Do, the way or path, this element connects Jeet Kune Do to the great traditions of Eastern philosophy. But unlike many traditional martial arts that present their Do as the definitive path, the Do in Jeet Kune Do is intensely personal. It is not my way imposed upon you. It is the path that emerges when you honestly confront the reality of combat and your own capabilities. I named this approach at a specific moment in my life, when I realized that all my technical knowledge was worthless if it did not serve a deeper purpose: liberation from artificial constraints. I had mastered Wing Chun, studied Western boxing, explored fencing principles, and absorbed elements from countless systems. Yet I found myself increasingly confined by the very knowledge meant to liberate me. The birth of Jeet Kune Do came when I stopped adding and began subtracting. Traditional martial arts follow a path of accumulation: more techniques, more forms, more patterns to memorize. With each belt, with each level, students acquire more content. But this process often leads to confusion rather than clarity, rigidity rather than adaptability. Jeet Kune Do follows the opposite trajectory. We begin by questioning everything, by testing every technique against the unforgiving standard of real combat. What fails this test, we discard. What survives, we refine further, stripping away unnecessary movement, eliminating wasted energy, simplifying until only the essential remains. Think of sculpture. The great Michelangelo did not create David by adding clay to a frame. He carved away marble until the figure within the stone was revealed. Similarly, in Jeet Kune Do, we do not build a fighter by adding layers of technique. We reveal the fighter within by removing the habits, tensions, and preconceptions that prevent natural expression. This philosophy of simplification extends to how we approach knowledge itself. A library filled with thousands of books may contain great wisdom, but only the books you have actually read and understood have any value to you. Similarly, a martial artist who knows 1,000 techniques, but can apply none of them effectively in combat, possesses only an illusion of knowledge. In Jeet Kune Do, we prefer functional understanding of a few principles over superficial familiarity with many techniques. We would rather have 3 movements we can execute with precision, power, and appropriate timing than 30 we perform with hesitation. The characters who represent Jeet Kune Do in written form include the symbol for remove or take away. This is no accident. The heart of this approach is not what we add to ourselves, but what we remove. The tensions that slow us, the thoughts that distract us, the movements that waste our energy, and the preconceptions that blind us to what is actually happening. So when you hear Jeet Kune Do, understand that you are not hearing the name of just another style to be placed alongside karate, kung fu, or taekwondo. You are hearing a challenge to the very concept of style itself, a call to move beyond the artificial boundaries that separate one approach from another, and to rediscover the unity that exists beneath all martial expressions. Jeet Kune Do is not a destination I have reached and now describe to you. It is a process of discovery I invite you to undertake for yourself. The interception, the focused energy, the personal path, these await your exploration, not as concepts to understand intellectually, but as experiences to embody physically. With this foundation established, let us now examine the specific principles that guide this exploration, beginning with the principle of simplicity, which underlies everything else we will discuss. The first principle of Jeet Kune Do, perhaps the most important, is simplicity. My journey toward this understanding was neither quick nor easy. For many years, I did what most martial artists do. I collected techniques. I learned elaborate forms. I practiced intricate sequences of movement. I believed, as many still do, that mastery meant accumulation, that the more techniques I possessed, the more complete my martial arts would become. This path led me to proficiency in Wing Chun and exposure to dozens of other styles. But with each new technique I learned, with each new form I mastered, a question began to grow within me. Was I becoming more effective or merely more complicated? The answer came during real exchanges, real fights, not in the kwun or dojo, but in actual combat. Under genuine pressure, when adrenaline flooded my system and time compressed, I discovered that 95% of what I had learned simply disappeared. My body did not turn to the elaborate techniques or complex forms. Instead, it returned to what was simple, direct, and natural. This realization was both illuminating and humbling. Years of training certain movements, and in the crucible of combat, they vanished like smoke. Only the simplest, most direct expressions remained accessible. This was not a failure of memory or training. It was a profound insight into human nature itself. Under pressure, we do not rise to the level of our aspirations. We fall to the level of our foundations. If those foundations are built on complexity, they will crumble when tested. If they are built on simplicity, they will endure. Now let me be clear about something vitally important. Simplicity is not the same as being simplistic. The simplistic approach lacks depth, lacks understanding, lacks nuance. It is the crude approximation of something complex without grasping its essence. True simplicity is what emerges when you understand something so thoroughly that you can identify its essential nature and express it directly. It is what remains when you eliminate the superfluous, the decorative, the unnecessary. Einstein said, "Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler." This perfectly expresses our approach in Jeet Kune Do. We do not oversimplify combat to the point of naivety. We simplify it to the point of essence. Consider the difference between these two strikes. In the traditional approach, a practitioner might chamber their hand at the hip, rotate the arm through a prescribed arc, extend the limb along a specific trajectory, and then return it along a predetermined path. 5 distinct movements to execute a single technique. In Jeet Kune Do, we observe that the distance between your hand and the target can be covered in a single direct movement. No chamber, no prescribed path, no elaborate return, just the most efficient connection between 2 points. Is this approach simplistic? No. It is informed by deep understanding of biomechanics, timing, distance, and psychology. But its expression is simple. This principle applies not just to individual techniques, but to our entire approach to combat. Many martial arts teach specific responses to specific attacks. If the opponent does X, you respond with Y. This creates an illusion of comprehensiveness, but actually produces overwhelming complexity. It turns the martial artist into a filing cabinet, frantically searching through thousands of technique cards as an attack approaches. Instead of this approach, Jeet Kune Do teaches principles that can be applied in any situation. When you understand principles instead of memorizing techniques, your responses emerge naturally from your understanding rather than from rote memory. This simplification process offers another powerful advantage. It aligns with how humans naturally learn and develop skill. Consider how a child learns to walk. They do not memorize the exact sequence of muscle contractions required. They embody a principle, balance in motion, and their bodies naturally organize themselves around this principle. Similarly, in Jeet Kune Do, we do not program ourselves with countless if-then scenarios. We cultivate understanding of fundamental principles and allow our natural intelligence to express these principles in appropriate ways. The journey towards simplicity requires something many find difficult: the willingness to eliminate what might be useful but is not essential. This means making hard choices about what to include in your training and what to exclude. In my own journey, I had to set aside techniques I had spent years perfecting. Some were beautiful. Some were impressive to observers. Some had deep traditional significance. But they failed the ultimate test. They did not serve the purpose of actual combat in the most direct way possible. This was painful. It felt at times like abandoning old friends. But as these complex techniques fell away, what remained became increasingly refined, increasingly potent, increasingly reliable under pressure. Think of a cup filled with muddy water. If you want clear water, you have 2 options. You can add more water and hope to dilute the mud, or you can allow the cup to sit undisturbed until the mud settles and the water clears. The first approach, addition, never produces truly clear water. The second approach, subtraction through stillness, reveals clarity that was always present. Jeet Kune Do follows this second path. We do not add more and more techniques hoping to dilute what doesn't work. We strip away the non-essential, allowing the effectiveness that was always within us to emerge naturally. There is a story about the great sculptor Michelangelo that illuminates this principle perfectly. When asked how he created his masterpiece, David, he replied, "I simply took away everything that wasn't David." In Jeet Kune Do, we apply the same approach to combat. We remove everything that isn't effective, everything that isn't direct, everything that doesn't express our natural fighting abilities. The result is not an impoverished martial art, but an incredibly rich one. Rich not in quantity of techniques, but in quality of expression, not in complexity of movement, but in depth of understanding. At the end of your training day, ask yourself, did I add something today, or did I take something away? If your answer is always the former, you may be moving away from mastery rather than toward it. The ultimate goal of this simplification is a state I call the quality of no quality, or the form of no form. It is when your movements are so natural, so unaffected, so direct, that they appear to have no formal structure at all. This is not the beginning of the journey. The untrained also have no visible form. It is the end of the journey, where training has been so thoroughly integrated that it disappears from view, while its effects remain fully present. In your own training, begin this process of simplification today. Examine every technique you practice and ask, is this the most direct way? Is there anything here I can eliminate while preserving or enhancing effectiveness? Be ruthless in this questioning. Be willing to discard even what you have practiced for years if something simpler proves more effective. Remember, under the pressure of real combat, complexity dissolves. Only simplicity remains accessible. Build your foundation on this bedrock, and it will not fail you when you need it most. Let us now explore the second principle of Jeet Kune Do, which follows naturally from simplicity, non-classical thinking. The second principle of Jeet Kune Do is what I call non-classical thinking. This principle was born from my personal struggles against the limitations imposed by traditional martial arts systems. Struggles that began long before I had the language to articulate them. When I was a young man training in Hong Kong, I excelled within the Wing Chun system under the tutelage of Ip Man. I practiced diligently, mastered the forms, and became proficient in the techniques. By all traditional measures, I was a successful student. Yet something within me remained unsatisfied, unconvinced that the boundaries of this system, or any single system, could contain the full truth of combat. This feeling intensified when I came to America. Here I encountered martial artists from diverse backgrounds, karateka, judoka, boxers, wrestlers, each convinced their approach was superior, each trapped within the architecture of their own style. I observed how these classical systems compartmentalized fighting, dividing what should be unified, separating what should flow together. Classical thinking in martial arts manifests in many ways. It appears as rigid categories. This is a block. This is a strike. This is a kick. It shows up as predetermined patterns. If the opponent does X, you must respond with Y. It emerges as stylistic dogma. A proper punch must rotate exactly this way. A proper stance must have precisely this width. These classical boundaries are comfortable. They provide structure. They offer certainty. They create the illusion of comprehensive knowledge. But they do so at a tremendous cost. They restrict your ability to see what actually exists before you. My turning point came during a private demonstration in 1964. I was showing the Wing Chun straight punch to a small audience. A respected master in attendance challenged me, saying, "That is not a punch. A true punch must start from the hip and rotate with the whole body." For a moment, I was taken aback. Then clarity struck me like lightning. I realized we were not disagreeing about the effectiveness of the movement. We were imprisoned by different classical definitions of what constitutes a proper punch. At that moment, I understood that classical thinking was not merely a feature of martial arts training. It was a perceptual cage that prevented practitioners from seeing beyond their stylistic walls. I began to question everything. Why must a punch follow this specific path? Why must a kick chamber in this particular way? Why must combat be segmented into these distinct categories? This questioning was not rebellion for its own sake. It was a necessary step toward liberation. I came to understand that classical thinking keeps you perpetually at the level of technique, the what of martial arts. Non-classical thinking allows you to penetrate to the level of principle, the why of martial arts. Consider how children learn. A child does not approach a new experience through the filter of existing categories. They see what is actually there, not what they expect to see. They respond to what is happening, not to what they've been told should happen. This natural, unfiltered perception is what I seek to recapture in Jeet Kune Do. Let me be clear. Non-classical thinking does not mean disrespecting the wisdom of those who came before us. The classical traditions contain profound insights, effective techniques, and valuable training methods. The problem arises when these traditions become dogmatic, when "this is how it has always been done" becomes sufficient justification for continuing to do it that way. In Jeet Kune Do, we approach traditional wisdom with both respect and skepticism. We honor the insights of past masters by taking them seriously enough to question them, to test them, to verify their validity in our own experience. This is the highest form of respect, not blind acceptance, but thoughtful engagement. I learned this approach through painful experience. In my early days of teaching in America, I continued to present modified Wing Chun as a superior system. I had traded one classical limitation for another, slightly expanded classical limitation. It was my students' questions that pushed me further. When they asked, why this way and not that way, I found myself relying on arguments from authority, because the system says so. This unsatisfied them, and ultimately, it unsatisfied me as well. Real growth began when I allowed myself to say the most powerful words a martial artist can speak. I don't know. Let's find out together. This approach, this non-classical thinking, transformed not just my martial arts, but my entire relationship with knowledge. Non-classical thinking requires intellectual courage. It means standing apart from the comfort of consensus. It means facing the vertigo of uncertainty. It means acknowledging that the map you've been following, however detailed, is not the territory itself. Many martial artists fear this courage. They worry that questioning fundamental aspects of their style equals betraying it. They conflate loyalty to their teachers with unwavering acceptance of everything those teachers conveyed. They mistake the container for the content, the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. In my own journey, this fear manifested in unexpected ways. Even as I began teaching a more liberated approach, I found myself creating new patterns, new systems, new classifications. The pull toward classical thinking is so strong that even in the act of breaking free from it, we risk creating new dogmas, new limitations, new cages. This is why non-classical thinking must be a continuous practice, not a one-time revelation. We must question not just the traditions we inherit, but also the new understanding we develop. We must remain vigilant against the calcification of our own insights, the hardening of our own discoveries into rigid doctrine. The balance between respecting wisdom and finding personal truth is not found through compromise. It is not about being 50% traditional and 50% innovative. It is about being 100% committed to reality as it presents itself in your direct experience. When you approach combat non-classically, you see your opponent not as a collection of techniques to be countered with your own catalogue of responses. You see them as they actually are in this moment, their balance, their tension, their openings, their intentions. You respond not according to predetermined patterns, but according to the actual situation unfolding before you. This approach requires rigorous honesty. Many claim to have transcended classical thinking while remaining firmly within its grip. They reject one system only to create another. They discard old limitations only to establish new ones. True, non-classical thinking is not about replacing one framework with another. It is about developing the ability to use frameworks when they are helpful and set them aside when they are not. I discovered this truth through countless hours of what I call research sparring. Combat conducted not to win or lose, but to discover what actually works, what actually happens when two humans engage in combat without predetermined patterns. This research taught me that combat has its own reality, independent of any system created to describe it. The deepest understanding arises when you can see both through and beyond classical categories, when you can use them as tools without being confined by them. This is the difference between an artist who has mastered fundamental techniques and can move beyond them to create something truly original, and one who merely executes techniques with precision but without personal expression. In your own training, begin cultivating non-classical thinking today. When practicing a technique, don't just ask, "Am I doing this correctly according to the system?" Ask, "Is this actually effective? Does this actually make sense for my body, for my attributes, for the reality of combat as I understand it?" Be willing to stand alone in your conclusions, if that's where honest inquiry leads you. Remember, the ultimate authority in Jeet Kune Do is not any teacher, any text, any tradition, not even me. The ultimate authority is reality itself, as you experience it directly. This is the essence of non-classical thinking. From this foundation of questioning predetermined patterns and finding your own truth, we move naturally to the third principle of Jeet Kune Do, adaptability. The third principle of Jeet Kune Do is adaptability, a concept so central to my understanding of martial arts and life that it has become synonymous with my philosophy. Many of you have heard me say, "Be water, my friend." These words are not merely poetic. They represent the essence of what I have discovered through years of training, fighting, and deep reflection. Water has fascinated me since childhood. Growing up in Hong Kong, I was surrounded by it. The harbour, the rains, the very air heavy with moisture. I observed how water interacts with the world, how it yields to obstacles, yet ultimately overcomes them, how it takes the shape of whatever contains it, yet maintains its essential nature, how it can be gentle enough to nurture life and powerful enough to carve through stone. As a young martial artist, I was rigid in both body and mind. I held tension in my muscles. I clung to techniques I had mastered. I defended positions I had taken. This rigidity created a brittleness in me, physically and intellectually. When faced with something unexpected, I would break rather than bend, resist rather than flow. My transformation began with a humbling experience. In 1962, I faced an opponent whose style I had never encountered. My practiced responses proved ineffective. My techniques failed to land. For several minutes, though it felt like hours, I struggled against this new reality, trying to force my approach to work through sheer will. The result was exhaustion, frustration, and ultimately, defeat. That night I sat beside the ocean, watching the waves meet the shore. Each wave approached differently, some with force, some with gentleness. Yet the water always found its way through, around, and over the rocks. It never struggled against reality. It simply recognized and flowed with it. In that moment, I understood that true mastery lies not in resisting circumstances, but in adapting to them completely. Adaptability in combat manifests in several ways. First, it appears as tactical flexibility, the ability to change your approach based on what is actually happening rather than what you expected to happen. Many fighters develop a favorite technique or a go-to strategy. When this works, they appear brilliant. When it fails, they have no recourse, no capacity to adjust. In Jeet Kune Do, we cultivate what I call alive awareness, a state of perception that recognizes changing circumstances without judgment or resistance. If you throw a punch and your opponent blocks it, do you continue trying to make that punch work? Or do you immediately flow into another approach? If your preferred fighting range is nullified, do you struggle to reimpose it? Or do you adapt to the new range? Your answers reveal your adaptability. I experienced this need for tactical adaptation dramatically in a private match with a karate practitioner in 1964. He was exceptional at maintaining distance, thwarting my attempts to close and use my preferred techniques. For 2 full minutes, I tried to impose my game on him, growing increasingly frustrated. Then I remembered, be water. I stopped trying to force my approach and instead adapted to the reality before me. I began using longer range techniques, drawing him into exchanges that gradually allowed me to close distance on my terms. The match shifted immediately. But adaptability goes deeper than tactical adjustments. It requires mental flexibility, the ability to release preconceptions about what should work and embrace what actually does work. This mental flexibility precedes physical adaptability. Without it, your body might know many techniques, but your mind will filter out the most appropriate ones if they don't match your expectations or preferences. I cultivated this mental flexibility through a practice I called the emptying of the cup. Each day before training, I would mentally set aside everything I thought I knew. I would approach my practice as if I were a beginner, with no investment in particular outcomes, no attachment to specific techniques. This mental practice transformed my physical expression, allowing me to move without the friction of preconception. This approach was tested severely during the filming of Enter the Dragon. The script called for fighting scenes in varied environments, open spaces, confined rooms, among multiple attackers. Each environment demanded different approaches. In one particular scene, filmed in a mirror room, the confined space and unique visual environment required complete adaptation. My prepared choreography proved ineffective. The space was too restrictive for the movements I had planned. Rather than force my planned approach, I paused, observed the actual space, and allowed new movements to emerge that harmonized with the environment. The result was one of the most iconic scenes in martial arts cinema. Not because I imposed my will on the circumstances, but because I adapted completely to them. Adaptability manifests in life just as it does in combat. My journey from Hong Kong to America required profound adaptation. I faced language barriers, cultural differences, and racial prejudice. I could have resisted these realities, railed against them, or tried to force my way through them unchanged. Instead, I chose to be water, to recognize the landscape and flow accordingly, maintaining my essential nature while adapting my expression to new circumstances. When I arrived in America, I spoke limited English with a heavy accent. Rather than hide this or apologize for it, I incorporated it into my teaching, using physical demonstration where words failed, finding simple, powerful phrases that crossed the language barrier. What could have been a limitation became a characteristic aspect of my communication style. Similarly, when faced with Hollywood's limited roles for Asian actors, I could have either accepted those limitations or furiously fought against the system. Instead, I adapted by creating my own opportunities, writing treatments, developing concepts, and eventually producing my own expression through film. Like water, I did not break myself against the obstacle. I found the path around it. The relationship between mental and physical adaptability cannot be overstated. Your body cannot adapt to what your mind refuses to accept. If you face an opponent whose speed exceeds your expectations, you must first acknowledge this reality mentally before your body can adjust appropriately. If you deny the reality, thinking, "No one can be that fast," or "my technique should have worked," your adaptive capacity is crippled before physical adjustment can even begin. I developed an exercise to cultivate this mental-physical connection. I would have a training partner attack me in varied, unexpected ways, while I maintained a mental mantra: I accept what is happening. This simple phrase short-circuited my tendency to resist reality and accelerated my adaptive response. Over time, the gap between recognition and adaptation narrowed until they became nearly simultaneous. This exercise revealed something profound. Adaptability is not just a tactical choice. It is a capacity that can be developed systematically. Like a muscle that strengthens through proper training, adaptability grows through deliberate exposure to changing circumstances, conscious release of rigid expectations, and practiced responsiveness to what actually exists rather than what you anticipated. Water teaches us this lesson constantly. Pour water into a cup, it becomes the cup. Pour it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Pour it into a river, it flows. The water doesn't decide beforehand what shape it should take. It doesn't resist the vessel that contains it. It doesn't try to maintain a shape that no longer fits its circumstances. It simply adapts completely to present reality. In your own training, develop adaptability through deliberate variability. Train in different environments. Practice with partners of different sizes, strengths, and styles. Intentionally place yourself in unfamiliar circumstances. Each time you encounter something unexpected, resist the urge to immediately categorize it according to past experience. See it freshly. Respond to it uniquely. Be water. Remember, the highest form of adaptability is not consciously choosing between prepared responses. It is training your unconscious mind to respond appropriately without the friction of thought. When water encounters an obstacle, it doesn't contemplate various options for getting around it. It simply flows according to its nature. Your ultimate goal is this same effortless adaptation, responding not from calculation, but from cultivated instinct. This principle of adaptability connects naturally to our fourth principle, interception. For only when you have developed the capacity to adapt completely to changing circumstances can you begin to intercept intention before it manifests as action. Let us explore this connection now. The fourth principle of Jeet Kune Do, interception, gives our art its very name. Jeet means to intercept or stop, but interception in Jeet Kune Do goes far beyond the physical act of stopping an opponent's technique with your own. It represents a profound shift in how we understand combat awareness, timing, and efficiency. Most martial arts teach you to wait for an attack, then block it, then counter. This creates a 3-beat rhythm: their attack, your defense, your counter. Each beat represents time, precious milliseconds in which advantage can be gained or lost. Jeet Kune Do compresses this sequence, intercepting the attack during its formation. We do not block first, then counter. We intercept, neutralizing and striking in a single unified action. But the deepest form of interception happens before physical movement begins. This is the psychological dimension of interception that few martial artists truly understand. Combat does not begin with physical movement. It begins with intention. Before the hand moves to strike, before the foot lifts to kick, there is an impulse, a decision, a commitment in the mind of your opponent. This intention manifests in subtle cues: a shift in weight, a change in breathing, a narrowing of focus, a telegraphic tension in the shoulders or hands. The highest form of combat awareness is the ability to read these intentions before they manifest as physical attacks. I call this listening rather than seeing, because it involves a receptivity that goes beyond visual perception. When you truly listen to your opponent, you hear what they intend before they themselves fully realize it. I discovered this dimension of awareness through a painful lesson early in my training. I was sparring with an elder student who seemed to counter my attacks before I had even completed them. Frustrated, I asked him his secret. He smiled and said, "I am not fighting your hands or feet. I am fighting your mind. And your mind announces its intentions before your body moves." This insight transformed my understanding of combat. I began to study not just techniques, but the subtle prelude to techniques, the psychological and physiological signals that precede movement. I watched how intention manifests uniquely in each individual. How some telegraph with their eyes, others with breath, others with almost imperceptible shifts in balance or tension. Developing this anticipatory awareness requires a fundamental shift in attention. Most practitioners focus on what is happening, the actual movement of an attack. In Jeet Kune Do, we train to perceive what is about to happen. This shift from reactive to anticipatory awareness represents the difference between ordinary martial arts and extraordinary martial arts. My personal approach to developing this capacity involved specific training methods that I refined over years of experimentation. The first method I call sensitivity sparring. Unlike traditional sparring focused on landing techniques, sensitivity sparring focuses on maintaining constant contact, physically through touch or perceptually through close distance, and developing heightened awareness of your opponent's subtle shifts. I begin with hand sensitivity exercises, where partners maintain light contact with their arms while attempting to touch each other's body. The contact between arms provides a direct channel of information about the opponent's intentions. Through this contact, you learn to feel the gathering of energy that precedes a movement, the subtle shift in pressure that indicates direction. This practice evolves from predetermined movements to free exploration, from conscious analysis to intuitive response. Eventually, you develop what I call touch without touching, the ability to sense intention across space without physical contact, as if the air itself communicates your opponent's thoughts to you. The second method involves what I call interrupted rhythm training. Most practitioners fall into predictable rhythms of movement: attack, defense, counter, or preparatory movement, attack, reset. These rhythms become habitual and therefore predictable. In this training, partners deliberately interrupt established rhythms, creating an environment where anticipation depends not on pattern recognition, but on direct perception of intention. For example, you might establish a rhythm of jab, cross, jab, repeated several times. Then, without warning, you change to jab, feint, hook. Your partner must respond not to the expected pattern, but to your actual intention as it forms. This trains the mind to remain open to what is actually happening, rather than what is expected to happen. The third method, perhaps the most demanding, is blind sensitivity. In this practice, one partner closes their eyes while the other moves around them, occasionally initiating attacks from varying angles and distances. The blind partner must sense the attack's formation and intercept it without visual cues. This practice forces reliance on what I call the sixth sense of combat, that intuitive awareness that operates beyond the five conventional senses. I remember demonstrating this practice at a seminar in Oakland in 1967. Many observers assumed I was peaking, or that my partner was following a choreographed sequence. Neither was true. After years of training this sensitivity, I could feel the displacement of air, hear the subtle shift in my partner's breathing, sense the gathering of energy that preceded movement. This is not mystical. It is the result of refined perception, trained through thousands of hours of practice. The relationship between interception and efficiency becomes clear when we understand that combat is fundamentally about time and energy management. Every movement requires time to execute and energy to power. By intercepting intention rather than completed action, you dramatically compress the time needed to respond and conserve the energy that would be wasted in separate blocking and countering movements. Consider this. If you wait for an attack to reach its target before defending, you have already conceded time and space to your opponent. You must then expend energy to reclaim that space, to shift from defensive to offensive posture. This transition creates a gap, a moment of vulnerability. But when you intercept during the attack's formation, you concede nothing. You maintain both positional and psychological advantage, using minimal energy for maximum effect. I experienced the efficiency of interception most dramatically during a private match in 1965. My opponent was known for explosive kicks launched from seemingly relaxed positions. Others defended by increasing distance or preparing generic blocks, both energy-intensive strategies. Watching him carefully before our match, I noticed a subtle tell, the slightest compression in his posture before launching his kicks, almost imperceptible, but consistent. When we engaged, I focused not on his feet or even his hips, but on this preparatory compression. The first time he gathered himself to kick, I intercepted with a straight punch that landed as his weight shifted but before his foot left the ground. The efficiency was remarkable. Minimal movement, minimal energy expenditure, maximum effect. He later told me it felt as if I had read his mind. This efficiency extends beyond physical economy to psychological impact. When you consistently intercept an opponent's intentions, you create a powerful psychological effect, a sense that you can see into their mind, that nothing they plan remains hidden from you. This awareness creates hesitation, and hesitation destroys effective action. Your opponent begins thinking about their movements rather than simply executing them, introducing a fatal gap between intention and action. Interception as a principle applies beyond combat to all human interaction. In conversation, truly listening means hearing not just the words being spoken, but the thoughts forming before they're expressed. In business negotiations, it means perceiving the underlying interests that precede stated positions. In any dynamic exchange, interception represents the highest form of engagement, meeting reality as it forms rather than after it has solidified. To develop interception in your own practice, begin with this fundamental shift. Train your awareness to focus not on what is happening, but on what is about to happen. Watch not the punch, but the shoulder that tenses before the punch. Listen not to the words, but to the intake of breath that precedes them. Feel not the pressure, but the gathering of energy that comes before pressure increases. Start with slow, controlled exchanges where you can consciously perceive these precursors. As your sensitivity increases, gradually increase speed and complexity while maintaining this anticipatory awareness. Eventually, what begins as conscious observation becomes intuitive perception. Your body responding to intentions before your conscious mind fully registers them. Remember that interception is not prediction based on pattern recognition. It is direct perception of unfolding reality. Prediction fails when patterns change. Interception succeeds regardless of pattern, because it reads the moment-to-moment formation of intention rather than assuming continuation of established patterns. The ultimate expression of interception occurs when your response begins not just before your opponent's attack lands, not just before their movement completes, but before their intention fully crystallizes. At this level, the distinction between action and reaction dissolves. There is only simultaneous awareness and response, a unity of perception and action that represents the highest accomplishment in martial arts. The fifth principle of Jeet Kune Do is economy of motion, a concept that transformed not only my approach to martial arts, but my entire philosophy of living. This principle emerged from a personal realization that came to me during an exhausting training session in 1963. I had been practicing combinations for hours, executing what I believed were perfect techniques according to my Wing Chun training. Yet despite my technical correctness, I found myself unnecessarily fatigued. That evening, while reviewing footage of my training, I noticed something revelatory. Between each technique, I made subtle, unnecessary movements, adjustments of stance, resets of hand position, shifts in weight distribution that served no functional purpose. These movements were so ingrained that I had never consciously registered them. They were invisible to me, but consumed both time and energy. This observation sparked what became an obsession with efficiency, with eliminating every unnecessary movement, every wasted action, every motion that did not directly contribute to my intended outcome. I began to analyze not just my martial techniques, but every physical action through this lens. Does this movement serve a necessary function? Could the same result be achieved with less effort? Is there a more direct path to my objective? The most profound embodiment of economy of motion is found in the concept of the straight line. In geometry, the shortest distance between 2 points is always a straight line. In Jeet Kune Do, we apply this mathematical truth to combat. If your objective is to strike a target, why travel along a curved or indirect path when a straight line will get you there more quickly, with less energy expenditure, and with greater force? Consider the difference between a traditional karate reverse punch and the Jeet Kune Do straight punch. The karate punch travels in a semicircular path, pulling back before extending forward. The Jeet Kune Do punch travels directly from its starting position to the target. The straight line path is not just marginally more efficient, it is dramatically more efficient, reducing both the time of execution and the energy required. But this concept extends far beyond punching mechanics. It became a philosophical framework through which I examined all aspects of life. I began to see how indirect action permeates human behavior, how we often take circuitous routes toward our goals, adding unnecessary steps, creating artificial complexity, obscuring simple truths beneath elaborate explanations. In my own life, I applied economy of motion to my decision-making processes. I found myself constantly asking, what is the most direct path toward my objective? What activities, relationships, or pursuits drain energy without providing proportional value? Where am I moving in circles when I could be moving in straight lines? This analysis led me to make difficult but clarifying choices. I simplified my training methodologies, eliminating exercises that produced minimal returns on time invested. I restructured my teaching curriculum to focus on foundational principles rather than catalogues of techniques. I even reorganized my daily schedule to minimize transition time between activities. These changes were not merely practical. They were philosophical implementations of economy of motion in domains beyond physical combat. The conservation of energy through economical movement became both a physical and spiritual practice for me. I observed how most people move through their days unconsciously expending energy that could be conserved, energy potentially available for growth, creativity, and purposeful action. In martial arts, this wastage is often glorified as hard work or pushing through exhaustion, but I came to see it differently. True mastery is not about how much energy you expend, but how little energy you need to expend to achieve your objective. This understanding transformed my training approach. Rather than measuring progress by how exhausted I felt after practice, a common but misguided metric, I began measuring it by how fresh I remained while achieving the same or better results. I developed exercises specifically designed to identify and eliminate energy leakage in technique execution. One such exercise I called minimal engagement sparring. In this practice, partners would engage with the explicit goal of using the least amount of movement and energy necessary to be effective. After each exchange, we would analyze, could that defense have been executed with less movement? Could that counter have been more direct? Could that footwork have been more efficient? Through this practice, I discovered something counterintuitive. The less I moved, the more effective I became. By eliminating unnecessary motion, I not only conserved energy, but actually increased power, improved timing, and enhanced unpredictability. This seemingly paradoxical relationship between reduction and enhancement became a cornerstone of my understanding. I recall demonstrating this principle at a seminar in San Francisco in 1968. A skeptical practitioner challenged me, saying that my approach would sacrifice power for speed. To address his concern, I performed the same strike twice, once with traditional chambering and hip rotation, and once with the economical motion of Jeet Kune Do. The striking power was measured against an impact pad. Not only was the economical strike delivered more quickly, but it also registered greater impact force. This wasn't magic, it was physics. The elimination of unnecessary movement reduced energy leakage and allowed for more direct force transfer. My personal observations of other fighters consistently confirmed this principle. I studied boxers, wrestlers, fencers, and martial artists from various traditions, always noting a common pattern. The most effective practitioners in any discipline were invariably those who achieved their results with minimal extraneous movement. This was true regardless of the specific techniques or strategies they employed. One of my most enlightening observations came from watching an elderly Tai Chi master push hands with younger, stronger practitioners. Despite his advanced age and diminished physical strength, he consistently controlled these exchanges through perfect economy of motion. He never opposed force directly, which would have required significant energy expenditure, but instead made minute adjustments that redirected his opponent's energy back against them. His movements were so subtle they were nearly invisible, yet devastatingly effective. This was economy of motion elevated to an art form. The spiritual dimension of this principle became increasingly significant to me over time. I began to recognize how economy of motion relates to broader philosophical concepts across cultures. In Taoism, it connects to Wu Wei, action through non-action. In Zen, it reflects the concept of Mushin, the uncluttered mind that responds without unnecessary deliberation. In Western philosophy, it aligns with Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Through this cross-cultural lens, I came to understand economy of motion not just as a martial principle, but as a universal truth expressed in various forms throughout human wisdom traditions. This understanding deepened my commitment to embodying this principle in all dimensions of life. In your own exploration of economy of motion, begin with simple awareness. Observe your own movements, in training, in daily activities, in conversation, in thought. Notice where you add unnecessary steps, where you create complexity that doesn't serve your purpose, where you expend energy that yields no proportional return. Start with physical movement, as this is the most concrete expression. When executing a technique, ask yourself, is every component of this movement necessary? Does each motion serve a specific function? Could I achieve the same result with less movement? This questioning process itself is an exercise in economy, a direct path to understanding. Then extend this awareness to your thinking processes. Notice where your mind travels in circles rather than moving directly toward understanding. Observe when you add unnecessary complexity to simple matters. Recognize when you create elaborate justifications instead of acknowledging straightforward truths. Finally, apply this principle to your life choices. What activities, relationships, or pursuits in your life represent the curved path when a straight line is available? Where are you expending energy that could be conserved or redirected toward what truly matters to you? Remember that economy of motion does not mean reducing life to mechanical efficiency. It means eliminating what is unnecessary so that what is essential can flourish. It means clearing away the underbrush so that your true path becomes visible. It means conserving your limited energy for what genuinely deserves it. The ultimate expression of economy of motion is found not in rigidity, but in fluidity, in movements so efficient they appear effortless, in decisions so clear they seem inevitable, in a life so focused that every action holds purpose. This is the state I continuously strive toward, knowing that true mastery is not reaching a final destination, but engaging in constant refinement. This principle of economy naturally connects to our sixth principle, alive training. For only through practice that simulates the unpredictability of real combat can you discover what movements are truly necessary and what are merely habitual. Let us explore this connection next. The sixth principle of Jeet Kune Do is what I call alive training, perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of my approach when I first introduced it to the American martial arts world. This principle fundamentally changed how I practiced and taught, and it remains one of the most misunderstood yet essential elements of truly effective martial arts training. My journey toward alive training began with a profound disillusionment. As a young martial artist in Hong Kong, I excelled in forms, demonstrations, and choreographed exchanges. I won tournaments and received praise from my instructors. Yet, something troubled me deeply. The disconnect between what we practiced and the unpredictable nature of actual combat. This concern crystallized one evening in 1959, when I witnessed a confrontation between two men outside a restaurant in Kowloon. One was clearly trained in traditional kung fu. His stance and initial movements revealed years of formal practice. The other had no obvious training, but possessed raw aggression and unpredictability. When they engaged, the trained martial artist attempted to apply his techniques as he had practiced them, with proper form, with traditional sequencing. But the untrained fighter didn't respond correctly. He didn't attack in the expected ways. He didn't retreat when he should have. The exchange quickly devolved into something that looked nothing like the choreographed training both I and the kung fu practitioner had devoted countless hours to perfecting. The trained fighter lost, not because his techniques were inherently flawed, but because his training had not prepared him for the chaotic, resistant reality of an actual fight. This moment haunted me. What good is perfect technique in isolation if it collapses under the pressure of resistance? What value is there in winning demonstrations if those same movements fail in actual application? From this questioning emerged my understanding of alive training, practice that incorporates the essential elements of real combat: timing, distance, energy exchange, and most critically, resistance. Without resistance, martial arts practice becomes a form of theatrical performance rather than preparation for combat reality. When I came to America and began teaching, I encountered a martial arts landscape dominated by what I call dead training. Students would spend years performing techniques against compliant partners who attacked in predetermined ways and responded in predetermined patterns. They would perfect forms executed against imaginary opponents who conveniently attacked exactly as the form was designed to counter. They would practice self-defense techniques against partners who deliberately made those techniques work. This approach not only failed to prepare practitioners for actual combat, it actively created false confidence, perhaps the most dangerous liability a martial artist can possess. When you believe you can defend yourself because your techniques work perfectly against cooperative partners, you develop a dangerous delusion that can have serious consequences when reality shatters that illusion. My evolution beyond static practice wasn't without resistance, both from others and from within myself. There is comfort in the predictable. There is satisfaction in performing techniques that always work, because your partner ensures they work. There is validation in mastering complex forms that look impressive, but have never been tested under pressure. Abandoning this comfort required intellectual honesty and courage. It meant admitting that much of what I had mastered might not function as intended when faced with a resisting opponent. It meant recognizing that some traditional practices, while culturally valuable and aesthetically beautiful, had limited combat application. This transition crystallized during a private teaching session in 1964. A student perfectly executed a series of self-defense techniques against my scripted attacks. His movements were textbook perfect, and he was clearly pleased with his performance. I then asked him a simple question. What if I don't attack exactly that way? What if I resist here instead of yielding there? What if I counter your counter? His confidence visibly deflated. He had been training for years, but had never considered these questions. His expertise existed within a narrow band of prescribed scenarios, outside of which lay a vast territory of uncertainty. That day, I restructured our entire session. Instead of practicing prescribed techniques, we engaged in what I now call progressive resistance training. We began with simple exchanges where I offered minimal resistance, allowing him to apply his techniques with slight adjustments. Gradually, I increased the resistance, varied my attacks, and responded unpredictably to his movements. The result was initially frustrating for him, but ultimately transformative. He discovered that while many of his techniques collapsed under resistance, the principles underlying those techniques remained sound. His straight punch still functioned when slightly modified to account for my movement. His kick still had value when adjusted for actual distance and timing. What changed was not the core mechanics, but the rigid expectations surrounding their application. This approach, gradually increasing resistance while preserving safety, became fundamental to Jeet Kune Do training methodology. It recognizes that effective learning occurs at the edge of capability, not within the comfort of mastery. If practice is too easy, no adaptation occurs. If it's too overwhelming, no learning is possible. The sweet spot lies in the productive struggle, where success is possible but not guaranteed. The balance between safety and reality in training represents one of the most challenging aspects of alive training. Traditional martial arts often err too far on the side of safety, creating unrealistic practice that fails to prepare students for actual combat. Contemporary full-contact fighting sports sometimes err too far toward reality, creating injury rates that limit consistent practice and career longevity. In Jeet Kune Do, we seek the optimal balance point, what I call functional realism. This approach incorporates protective equipment that allows for contact without injury, resistance levels that can be progressively increased, and scenarios that approximate combat reality while maintaining sufficient control to prevent serious harm. I developed specific training methods to implement these principles. One such method involves asymmetrical sparring, where one partner has restrictions while the other has advantages. For example, one person might be limited to only punching while the other can use full techniques, or one might need to accomplish a specific objective while the other tries to prevent it. This creates pressure and resistance while maintaining safety through controlled parameters. Another method involves attribute isolation, where we temporarily focus on developing a single attribute, speed, timing, power, etc., through scenarios designed specifically to pressure that attribute. This allows for intense development with manageable risk, gradually building the components that later combine in full application. Perhaps most importantly, we practice what I call discomfort training, deliberately placing ourselves in unfavorable positions, energy states, and scenarios. Most martial artists practice only what they're already good at, creating magnificent strengths alongside glaring weaknesses. By intentionally training in uncomfortable scenarios, when tired, when at disadvantageous angles, when surprised, we develop true adaptability rather than contextual expertise. My personal discoveries through pressure testing often contradicted established martial arts dogma. I found that many revered techniques simply failed under resistance. I discovered that some seemingly impractical movements actually functioned when properly understood and applied. I learned that psychological factors, the ability to maintain technique under pressure, to think clearly during intense exchanges, to manage fear and aggression, often determined outcomes more than technical knowledge. One particularly enlightening experience occurred during a full contact session with a boxing instructor in 1967. I had practiced a particular combination extensively and believed it would be devastatingly effective. When I attempted to apply it under pressure, the timing collapsed, the distance management failed, and the sequence broke down entirely. This wasn't because the technique was fundamentally flawed, but because my practice of it had lacked the essential element of a live resistance. I returned to this combination with a new approach. Rather than practicing it as a fixed sequence, I trained it as a concept that could adapt to changing circumstances. I practiced it against progressive resistance, allowed it to evolve based on feedback, and integrated it with movement and timing drills. When I next attempted it in full contact application, it functioned, not exactly as originally envisioned, but in a form that maintained the core principle while adapting to reality. This pattern repeated throughout my martial development. Pressure testing did not simply determine what worked and what didn't. It transformed how techniques were understood, practiced, and applied. It revealed that effectiveness lies not in the technique itself, but in the alive relationship between technique, resistance, and adaptation. The implications of alive training extend beyond martial application into how we approach knowledge itself. In traditional martial arts, knowledge is often treated as something to be preserved and protected, passed down through generations without alteration. In Jeet Kune Do, knowledge is something to be tested, refined, and evolved. No concept, no technique, no strategy is accepted on authority alone. Everything must survive the crucible of pressure testing. This approach creates what I call functional understanding, rather than theoretical knowledge. When you know something because you've tested it under resistance, experienced its successes, failures, and limitations firsthand, you possess it in a fundamentally different way than when you know something, because you've been told it or seen it demonstrated in controlled conditions. In your own training, implement a live practice gradually but consistently. Begin with specific techniques practiced against progressive resistance. Allow yourself to discover what works for you personally, rather than what should work according to external authority. Embrace the frustration that comes with techniques failing under pressure, recognizing that this failure is not an end point, but the beginning of genuine understanding. Create training environments that balance safety and reality. Use protective equipment to allow for contact without injury. Establish parameters that create pressure without unnecessary risk. Remember that the goal is not to hurt each other, but to develop functional skill through appropriate resistance. Perhaps most importantly, cultivate intellectual honesty about your own capabilities. The greatest impediment to growth is not technical limitation, but self-deception. The comfortable illusion that what works in controlled practice will work equally well in chaotic reality. Pressure testing strips away this illusion, replacing comforting fantasy with uncomfortable truth. This truth, while initially discouraging, forms the only solid foundation for genuine martial development. Alive training connects directly to our seventh principle, broken rhythm. For only when you have experienced the actual rhythms of combat through a live practice can you begin to manipulate these rhythms to your advantage. Let's explore this connection now. The seventh principle of Jeet Kune Do, broken rhythm, emerges from a fundamental observation about human behavior that I first began to notice during my early training in Hong Kong. People, even highly trained martial artists, tend to move in predictable patterns. These patterns manifest not just in the techniques they favor, but in the timing of their execution, the rhythm of their movement. Watch any martial artist long enough, and you begin to see these rhythmic signatures. Some advance with a distinctive cadence to their footwork. Others create consistent pauses between combinations. Some telegraph their intentions through preparatory movements that follow reliable timing. Even breathing often falls into predictable patterns that precede action. These observations fascinated me because they revealed a profound truth. Rhythm is both essential to human movement and a potential liability in combat. We naturally organize our actions into rhythmic patterns because rhythm creates efficiency through predictability. The same predictability that makes rhythm efficient also makes it exploitable. I began studying this phenomenon systematically, first in myself and then in others. I would film my own training and analyze the footage, not just for technical execution, but for timing patterns. I discovered that even when consciously attempting to vary my rhythm, I would unconsciously fall into new but equally predictable patterns. This revelation was both humbling and illuminating. My most enlightening observations came from watching high-level competitive fighters across various disciplines. Boxing matches particularly revealed how rhythm dictated exchanges. Fighters would establish rhythmic patterns, the probing jab at regular intervals, the consistent timing between defense and counter, the predictable cadence of footwork. And these patterns created a sense of order and control. But the most successful fighters, I noticed, were those who could break these established rhythms at will. Sugar Ray Robinson, whose boxing I studied extensively, would establish a rhythm with his jab-jab cross combination, repeating it with consistent timing until his opponent began anticipating it. Then suddenly, he would deliver the cross without the preceding jabs, or extend the pause between the second jab and the cross, or eliminate the pause entirely. These rhythm breaks consistently created openings that his opponents, entrained to the established pattern, could not defend against in time. This strategic value of unpredictability became central to my understanding of combat efficiency. If your opponent can predict when you will act, they gain a tremendous advantage regardless of what action you take. Conversely, if you can disrupt your opponent's ability to predict your timing, you create openings, even with techniques they might otherwise easily counter. In traditional martial arts, rhythm is often taught as something to perfect, consistent, reliable, metronomic. In Jeet Kune Do, we recognize rhythm as something to control and manipulate, sometimes consistent, sometimes broken, always intentional. This approach transforms rhythm from an unconscious habit into a tactical tool. I developed specific methods for transcending rhythmic limitations in my own practice. The first method I call rhythm awareness training. This begins with conscious recognition of your natural rhythmic tendencies. Record your shadowboxing, your sparring, your technique practice. Watch for patterns, not just in what you do, but when you do it. Note the timing between your movements, the cadence of your combinations, the spacing of your breaths. Once aware of these patterns, systematically disrupt them. If you naturally pause for a half second between techniques, practice eliminating this pause entirely. If you habitually throw techniques in threes, practice combinations of 2 and 4. If you unconsciously telegraph techniques with preparatory movements, work to eliminate these tells or vary their timing in relation to the technique. The second method involves what I call metronome breaking. Begin by performing techniques to a steady beat, whether from an actual metronome or simply counted in your head. Establish the rhythm deeply until your body naturally anticipates the next beat. Then, deliberately break this established pattern by accelerating, decelerating, or inserting unexpected pauses. This practice develops the ability to break rhythm as a conscious choice rather than an accidental variation. The third method, perhaps the most advanced, is what I term rhythmic independence. In music, rhythmic independence allows a drummer to play different patterns with each hand and foot simultaneously. In martial arts, it means developing the ability to operate different parts of your body on independent rhythmic patterns. Your footwork might maintain a steady rhythm, while your striking follows an entirely different timing. This creates a perceptual challenge for your opponent. When multiple rhythms exist simultaneously, which one do you track? I experienced the power of broken rhythm most dramatically during a private matching session in California in 1969. My opponent was a highly accomplished karateka who had studied my movement extensively. For the first exchanges, he anticipated my timing with uncomfortable accuracy, countering techniques that should have landed. I realized he had decoded my rhythmic patterns. Mid-exchange, I completely abandoned my natural rhythm, inserting unexpected pauses, accelerating without the usual preparatory movement, breaking combinations in unpredictable ways. The effect was immediate and dramatic. His timing, calibrated to my previous rhythm, completely collapsed. Techniques that he had been countering successfully now landed cleanly. His confidence visibly eroded as his ability to predict disappeared. This experience taught me that broken rhythm is not merely a physical technique, but a psychological strategy. When you break rhythm unexpectedly, you create not just a tactical opening, but cognitive dissonance in your opponent. Their mental model of the exchange, built on pattern recognition, suddenly fails to predict reality. This creates a moment of confusion, brief but significant, that compounds the advantage gained through the timing disruption itself. The philosophical value of unpredictability extends beyond combat into broader understanding of human interaction. Rhythm creates comfort through predictability, but growth often requires discomfort through unpredictability. This is true in learning, in creativity, and personal development. When we break the rhythms that define our habitual ways of being, we create openings for new possibilities to emerge. I applied this understanding to my teaching methodology as well. I noticed that students would fall into comfortable rhythms of learning, cycles of practice that felt productive because they were familiar. I would deliberately disrupt these rhythms, changing practice formats unexpectedly, introducing new challenges at unpredictable intervals, varying the intensity and focus of training sessions without warning. This approach created initial discomfort, but ultimately accelerated learning by preventing the stagnation that comes with rhythmic familiarity. The relationship between rhythm and self-expression is particularly profound. Your natural rhythm, the timing signature that emerges when you move without conscious manipulation, reveals something essential about your temperament, your energy, your character. Some practitioners naturally move with quick, staccato timing. Others flow with more languid, continuous rhythm. Neither is inherently superior, but each reveals something about the individual's authentic expression. In Jeet Kune Do, we do not seek to override these natural tendencies with standardized rhythm. Instead, we aim to understand our natural rhythmic signature, expand our capacity to vary it, and develop conscious control over when we express or break our natural patterns. This approach honors individual expression while expanding tactical capability. Think of rhythm as a language with its own vocabulary, grammar, and accent. Your natural rhythm is like your native accent, authentic to you and comfortable. Broken rhythm is like learning to speak with different accents at will, not to replace your natural speech, but to expand your expressive range and your ability to communicate effectively in different contexts. The ultimate expression of broken rhythm transcends conscious manipulation of timing. It emerges from a state of complete presence, what I call alive time, rather than clock time. In this state, you no longer think about accelerating or decelerating, about creating or breaking patterns. You simply respond to the unfolding moment with appropriate timing that naturally varies according to circumstance. This state resembles what musicians call playing in the pocket, where rhythm becomes so internalized that conscious thought about timing disappears, replaced by direct expression that feels simultaneously spontaneous and perfectly timed. This is not the absence of rhythm, but its complete integration, where rhythm serves expression rather than limiting it. In your own practice, begin with simple rhythm breaks. Establish a consistent timing for a particular technique or combination, then deliberately vary this timing, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, sometimes with unexpected pauses. Notice how even small variations in timing create significant changes in effectiveness. Progress to more complex rhythm manipulation, varying not just the timing between techniques, but the rhythm within techniques themselves. A single punch can be delivered with different internal rhythms: smooth acceleration throughout, explosive at initiation, then relaxed, gradually building force, and numerous other variations. Each creates a different perceptual challenge for your opponent. Finally, work toward the integration of broken rhythm as an expression of your combat personality, rather than a technical tool. Your timing should ultimately reflect your unique attributes, preferences, and strategic sensibilities, not as unconscious habit, but as deliberate choice aligned with authentic self-expression. Remember that rhythm itself is neither ally nor enemy. It is a medium through which combat unfolds, similar to how space and energy are media of combat. The mastery of rhythm means neither adhering to it rigidly nor breaking it randomly, but controlling it intentionally as circumstances require. This principle of broken rhythm connects naturally to our 8th principle, tools for range. For rhythm must always be understood in relation to distance, timing and spacing being inseparable aspects of combat positioning. Let us explore this connection next. The 8th principle of Jeet Kune Do focuses on what I call tools for range, the understanding and integration of different fighting distances into a complete combat system. This principle emerged from my observation of a critical limitation in traditional martial arts training. Most styles excel in one range, but remain dangerously deficient in others. My personal journey toward range integration began with frustration. As a Wing Chun practitioner, I had developed considerable skill in close-range combat, the trapping range where hands could make contact with the opponent's arms, where short punches and elbow strikes dominated. My techniques were effective, even devastating, within this specific distance. But I repeatedly encountered the same problem. What happens when I cannot reach this preferred range? What happens when an opponent keeps me at kicking distance, or conversely, takes me to the ground? These questions led me to a systematic analysis of combat ranges. Through observation, research, and direct experience, I identified 4 primary fighting distances, each with distinct characteristics and requirements. The first is kicking range, the furthest distance at which combat can effectively occur. At this range, only the longest weapons of the body, primarily the legs, can reach the target. This is the range where many traditional martial arts begin their engagements, where Taekwondo stylists and many karateka prefer to operate. The second is punching range, closer than kicking range, but still maintaining some space between combatants. At this distance, hand strikes can land with maximum force, utilizing the extension of the arms. This is the domain of boxers, the range where Western fighting science has developed its greatest sophistication. The third is trapping range, sometimes called bridging or close quarter range. Here, combatants are near enough that arms can make contact before strikes are fully extended. This range involves sticky hands, trapping, short strikes, and stand-up grappling. This is the specialized territory of Wing Chun, the range where I began my martial journey. The fourth is grappling range, where distance has been eliminated, bodies are in direct contact, and the fight typically continues on the ground. This is the domain of wrestlers, judoka, and jiu-jitsu practitioners, where leverage and position often matter more than striking power. Most martial arts systems focus predominantly on one of these ranges, while neglecting or insufficiently addressing the others. This specialization creates expertise within a narrow band of distance, but also creates vulnerability whenever the fight moves outside that preferred range. My approach to range in Jeet Kune Do differs fundamentally from traditional compartmentalization. Rather than specializing in one range or treating each range as a separate domain, requiring different skill sets, I sought to develop an integrated understanding of all ranges as parts of a continuous spectrum of combat distance. This integration began with a critical insight. Each range transition presents both danger and opportunity. The movement between kicking range and punching range, between punching range and trapping range, between trapping range and grappling range. These transitions are where fights are often won or lost. The practitioner who controls these transitions, who can move comfortably between ranges while forcing opponents into uncomfortable distances, possesses a tremendous advantage. I developed specific training methods to cultivate this transitional awareness. One approach I called range cycling drills. In these exercises, partners would begin at kicking range and progressively move through all ranges to grappling, then reverse the sequence back to kicking range. Initially practiced slowly with predetermined movements, these drills gradually incorporated greater speed, resistance, and unpredictability. Through this practice, I discovered that each range has what I call a critical moment of transition, a point where the dynamics fundamentally change, where techniques that were previously optimal become ineffective, and new options emerge. Recognizing these transition points, feeling them, rather than intellectually calculating them, became a central focus of my training. A personal breakthrough in my understanding occurred during a private matching session in 1966. My opponent was skilled in long-range karate techniques and determined to keep me at kicking distance, where his advantage was greatest. Previous to my range integration training, I would have stubbornly attempted to force my way to trapping range, regardless of resistance. But with my new understanding, I adapted differently. Instead of fighting against his range control, I fully accepted the kicking range he established. But I brought tools to this range that he didn't expect. Rather than attempting predictable entries to close distance, I utilized techniques I had developed specifically for operating effectively at longer ranges. When he adjusted to this unexpected competence, his adjustment created openings for me to control the transition to closer ranges on my terms. This experience confirmed what became a central tenet of Jeet Kune Do. The superior fighter is not one who excels in a particular range, but one who can control which range the fight occurs in, while remaining effective at all possible distances. This principle of range control manifests through several key aspects of Jeet Kune Do training. First, we develop range-specific expertise, technical proficiency appropriate to each fighting distance. This includes not just offensive techniques, but defensive capabilities, tactical awareness, and energetic understanding unique to each range. For kicking range, we focus on long-range weapons delivered with maximum efficiency, primarily straight kicks that maintain balance and recovery capability. Unlike many traditional systems that emphasize high, circular kicks that sacrifice stability for visual impression, we prioritize direct, rapid kicks that expose minimum vulnerability. For punching range, we emphasize what Western boxing calls the straight line, direct strikes that cover distance with minimum telegraphing and maximum efficiency. The lead straight punch becomes particularly important, a weapon that bridges distance quickly while maintaining defensive structure. For trapping range, we refine sensitivity and economy of motion, the ability to feel pressure and direction through contact and respond with minimum movement for maximum effect. The techniques here involve simultaneous defense and offense, trapping limbs while striking, controlling the center line while exploiting openings. For grappling range, we focus on position before submission, on maintaining structural advantage rather than applying specific techniques. Most importantly, we develop what I call negative grappling, the ability to prevent grappling from occurring when it doesn't serve our purpose, to disengage effectively when taken to unfavorable positions. The second aspect of range training involves what I call bridging techniques, specific movements designed to control transitions between ranges. These are neither purely offensive nor defensive, but transitional in nature. They facilitate movement from one range to another on your terms, rather than your opponent's. For example, the bridge between kicking and punching range might involve a front kick to the opponent's lead thigh, combined with forward momentum, simultaneously creating damage, disrupting balance, and closing distance. The bridge between punching and trapping range might involve a pak sao, slapping block, that makes contact with the opponent's lead arm while delivering a straight punch, transitioning from separate limbs to connecting bodies. Through years of research and experimentation, I discovered that mastery of these bridging techniques often matters more than expertise within any single range. The fighter who controls transitions dictates where the fight occurs, and this positional control frequently determines the outcome more decisively than technical superiority in isolation. The third aspect involves developing what I call range awareness, the perceptual ability to accurately judge distance and anticipate changes before they occur. This awareness begins as conscious measurement, but must eventually become intuitive, an unconscious sensing of spatial relationships that informs tactical decisions without requiring conscious calculation. I developed specific drills to cultivate this awareness. One involved practicing techniques with eyes closed, learning to feel distance through proprioception rather than visual cues. Another involved maintaining a specific range while both partners moved freely, developing the kinesthetic sense of distance independent of static positioning. Range awareness transforms combat effectiveness in profound ways. When you accurately perceive distance, not just where it is, but where it's going to be as bodies in motion converge or separate, you gain a predictive advantage that appears almost supernatural to those who lack this awareness. You intercept intentions related to distance before they manifest fully, positioning yourself advantageously while disrupting your opponent's positional strategy. My personal insights on range transitions crystallized through thousands of hours of what I call range pressure testing, sparring sessions specifically designed to challenge comfort at different distances. I would engage with specialists from various backgrounds: boxers, karateka, judoka, wrestlers, intentionally placing myself in their preferred ranges and developing tools to either operate effectively there or transition to more advantageous distances. These sessions revealed something crucial. Psychological comfort with specific ranges affects physical performance dramatically. Most practitioners develop range anxiety, discomfort, and reduced effectiveness when forced to operate outside their preferred distance. This anxiety manifests in tentative techniques, compromised structure, and hesitant transitions, all of which create exploitable vulnerabilities. In Jeet Kune Do, we deliberately address this psychological dimension through what I call range desensitization, progressively exposing practitioners to uncomfortable distances until the anxiety diminishes. A Wing Chun practitioner uncomfortable at kicking range might spend weeks focusing primarily on long-distance techniques. A grappler uncomfortable with striking exchanges might dedicate training cycles exclusively to punching range dynamics. Through this process, we develop not just technical capability, but psychological comfort across all ranges. This comfort translates directly to performance under pressure, the ability to remain composed and effective, regardless of where the fight occurs. The integration of ranges in Jeet Kune Do is not about becoming equally expert in all distances. Such universal specialization is neither practical nor necessary. Rather, it involves developing sufficient competence across all ranges while maintaining awareness of your particular strengths and weaknesses. Some practitioners will naturally excel at longer distances due to physical attributes or temperament. Others will find their greatest effectiveness in closer ranges. Jeet Kune Do does not attempt to override these natural tendencies, but rather to expand capability while leveraging inherent advantages. Your personal integration of ranges should reflect honest assessment of your attributes. If you possess long limbs and natural distance management skills, your range strategy might emphasize maintaining kicking and punching distances, while developing sufficient skill at closer ranges to return to your preferred distance when taken out of it. If you're more compact with powerful short-range techniques, you might focus on bridging techniques that reliably close distance while developing adequate long-range tools to facilitate this closure. The ultimate expression of range mastery in Jeet Kune Do is what I call range fluidity, the ability to move between distances without conscious thought, adapting continuously to changing spatial relationships. This fluidity emerges from thousands of repetitions across varied distances, from pressure testing against diverse opponents, from developing both technical tools and perceptual awareness specific to each range. When you achieve this fluidity, combat distances no longer appear as separate domains requiring conscious transition, but as aspects of a continuous spatial relationship that you navigate instinctively. Your techniques emerge appropriate to the distance available. Your positioning naturally exploits range advantages, and your tactical decisions incorporate spatial awareness without requiring deliberate calculation. In your own training, begin developing range integration through systematic exposure to all fighting distances. Practice techniques appropriate to each range, not with the expectation of equal mastery, but with the goal of functional competence. Focus particular attention on the transitions between ranges, developing specific bridging techniques that facilitate movement from distance to distance. Most importantly, pressure test your range capabilities against partners with different specialties. Engage with kickboxers at their preferred distance, with boxers at punching range, with grapplers in close-quarter situations. These experiences will reveal your actual capabilities more accurately than any theoretical understanding or cooperative practice. Remember that range mastery is not about perfection in all distances, but about honest capability and strategic awareness. Know where you fight most effectively, develop tools to reach and maintain those distances, and build sufficient skill at less preferred ranges to either operate effectively there or return to more advantageous positioning. The integration of these 8 principles, simplicity, non-classical thinking, adaptability, interception, economy of motion, alive training, broken rhythm, and tools for range, creates the foundation of Jeet Kune Do, not as a style, but as an approach to combat effectiveness. These principles do not exist in isolation, but form an interconnected system of understanding that, when fully integrated, transforms how you express yourself in combat. Let us now move beyond these specific principles to discuss the broader philosophy that unifies them. The concept of formlessness that distinguishes Jeet Kune Do from traditional martial arts systems. Now that we have explored the 8 core principles of Jeet Kune Do, I must address what is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of my approach: the concept of formlessness, what I sometimes call the style of no style, or the form of no form. This philosophy has created both fascination and confusion, with many practitioners claiming to understand it, while demonstrating through their actions that they have grasped only its surface. Let me begin by clarifying what formlessness is not, as misconceptions abound. When I speak of having no form, I'm not suggesting a lack of structure or an absence of technical foundation. I'm not advocating random, undisciplined movement based on instinct alone. I'm not rejecting the value of systematic training or deliberate skill development. These interpretations, common though they are, fundamentally misunderstand what formlessness means in Jeet Kune Do. Early in my teaching in America, a student attended several classes and then declared, "I understand now. Jeet Kune Do means just doing whatever feels natural." He proceeded to flail about with untrained movements, claiming he was expressing formlessness. This misunderstanding was so profound I had to address it immediately, not just for him, but for all present. What he demonstrated was not freedom from form, but ignorance of form. Not liberation through understanding, but confusion through lack of foundation. To understand formlessness properly, consider the journey of a calligrapher. The beginning student must meticulously study brush strokes, character composition, and proper technique. For years, they practice structured forms with disciplined precision. This stage is essential. Without it, no real progress is possible. But if the calligrapher remains forever at this stage, bound to rigid reproduction of what they have been taught, their work remains technically proficient, but spiritually empty. The master calligrapher, having internalized all technical elements so deeply they no longer require conscious attention, moves beyond form while still embodying its essence. Their work expresses something that transcends technique while still manifesting perfect technique. They are simultaneously bound by the discipline of their art and completely free within it. This paradoxical state, structured freedom, disciplined spontaneity, represents true formlessness. In practical terms, having no form means that your martial expression is not confined to a predetermined pattern, not limited by stylistic boundaries, not identified with a particular set of techniques. It means you respond to combat situations with movements that emerge naturally from your understanding, rather than from memorized sequences or prescribed reactions. I experienced the journey toward this understanding through the evolution of my own training. In my early years, I was completely bound by the forms of Wing Chun, the techniques, the drills, the tactical approaches specific to this system. I executed these forms with precision and effectiveness, but always within the framework I had been taught. My responses were, Wing Chun responses, regardless of whether they were optimal for the specific situation at hand. My transition began when I started questioning aspects of Wing Chun that didn't align with my direct experience of combat. Why maintain this specific angle when another proved more effective? Why execute this particular sequence when a simpler movement accomplished the same purpose? Why reject tools from other disciplines that addressed weaknesses in my primary system? These questions led me through a period of active experimentation, adopting elements from Western boxing, from fencing, from wrestling, from numerous martial arts traditions. During this phase, I was no longer purely practicing Wing Chun, but I had not yet reached formlessness. Instead, I had created what might be called a personal hybrid system, a collection of techniques from various sources, selected according to my preferences and experiences. This hybrid approach represented progress, but still fell short of true formlessness. I remained identified with specific techniques, my straight blast, my side kick, my trapping combinations. I had expanded my technical vocabulary, but was still speaking a language of predetermined forms, albeit forms I had personally selected, rather than inherited without question. The breakthrough toward genuine formlessness came through a specific realization that combat itself has a nature independent of any system created to navigate it. This nature includes universal principles, timing, distance, angle, momentum, psychological perception that transcend stylistic interpretation. When you align completely with these principles, responding directly to the combat situation rather than through the filter of a system, you enter the state of having no form while remaining maximally effective. In this state, techniques are not absent but transparent. They exist as possibilities rather than prescriptions. You don't discard the straight punch. You simply don't identify it as your technique or as the right technique. It becomes simply one possible expression among many, selected in the moment, based on direct perception of what the situation requires. This explains why Jeet Kune Do cannot be defined by a fixed set of movements. The moment we say, these techniques constitute Jeet Kune Do, we have betrayed its essential nature. We have created yet another style, another system, another limitation, precisely what Jeet Kune Do seeks to transcend. This is why I have sometimes said, only half-jokingly, that Jeet Kune Do is not Jeet Kune Do. The name itself is merely a convenience, a finger pointing toward an understanding that transcends codification. I once demonstrated this principle to a group of students through a simple exercise. I asked them to throw a ball to a target, first consciously thinking through all the mechanics: grip, arm position, weight transfer, release point. Their throws were stiff, mechanical, often inaccurate. Then I asked them to simply throw naturally, without analysis or predetermined technique. Their throws became fluid, effective, accurate. I pointed out that they had not abandoned technique. They had internalized it so completely that it operated without conscious management. This is the practical meaning of formlessness in combat. Not the absence of technique, but its complete integration. Not ignorance of form, but transcendence of form through thorough understanding. Not randomness, but naturalness. The difference being that natural movement emerges from internalized understanding, while random movement emerges from lack of structure. The journey toward this understanding differs dramatically from traditional martial arts progression. In most systems, the path is clearly marked. Learn this form, master this technique, progress to this level, receive this rank. The destination is predetermined, and success is measured by how closely you conform to established standards. It is a path of decreasing uncertainty and increasing conformity. In Jeet Kune Do, I offer not a path, but a direction. The journey involves increasing self-discovery rather than increasing conformity. I provide guidelines rather than commandments, principles rather than techniques, questions rather than answers. This approach requires more from the practitioner, more intellectual engagement, more personal responsibility, more comfort with uncertainty. This is why I say that Jeet Kune Do is not for everyone. Many martial artists seek the comfort of clear structure, the validation of recognized rank, the certainty of prescribed techniques. They want to know exactly what constitutes correct practice and how to measure their progress against established standards. This desire is completely understandable. It provides security and clear direction in the often confusing world of martial arts. Jeet Kune Do offers a different value: the freedom to discover your own expression within the reality of combat. This freedom comes not through rejection of structure, but through mastery of fundamentals so complete that structure becomes invisible. It emerges not by avoiding technical development, but by pursuing technical development beyond the point where techniques require conscious management. I have sometimes described this state through the Zen concept of mushin, or no mind, a condition where action emerges without the friction of conscious deliberation. The master archer does not calculate trajectory, wind resistance, and release timing. They simply shoot, and the arrow finds its target. This is not mystical. It is the natural result of training fundamentals so deeply that they operate below the threshold of conscious management. In your own journey toward understanding formlessness, begin not by rejecting form, but by mastering fundamentals. Develop technical proficiency not as an end in itself, but as a necessary foundation for later transcendence. Study various approaches, not to collect techniques, but to understand the principles that underlie effective movement, regardless of style. Most importantly, continually question your own understanding. The moment you believe you have arrived at formlessness, you have almost certainly fallen into a new, though perhaps more subtle, form. True formlessness is not a destination, but a continuous process of shedding limitations, including the limitation of believing you have transcended all limitations. I sometimes explain this journey through the Zen teaching of the 3 stages of mastery. In the first stage, mountains are mountains, and waters are waters. You see things conventionally, without deep understanding. In the second stage, mountains are no longer mountains, and waters are no longer waters. Your understanding has disrupted conventional perception, creating new insights, but also confusion. In the third stage, mountains are again mountains, and waters again waters. You have integrated deeper understanding with direct perception, returning to simplicity, but with profound comprehension. In martial arts terms, you begin by learning techniques as distinct entities with specific applications. You then deconstruct these techniques, questioning their components, experimenting with variations, understanding the principles that make them work. Finally, you reintegrate this understanding into movement that appears simple and natural, but contains the depth of everything you have learned. This cycle of learning, questioning, and reintegration is not completed once, but continues indefinitely. Each time you pass through it, your understanding deepens, your movement becomes more natural, your expression becomes more authentic. There is no final destination, only continuous evolution toward ever greater alignment with your own nature and with the reality of combat. Remember that formlessness is not a philosophical abstraction, but a practical approach to combat effectiveness. It emerges not from intellectual understanding alone, but from thousands of hours of physical practice under varying conditions with progressive resistance. It is tested not through theoretical debate, but through direct application against resisting opponents with different styles, attributes, and intentions. The paradox of Jeet Kune Do, of having form without being bound by form, of using technique without being limited by technique, of knowing the rules precisely so you can transcend them completely, finds its resolution not in words, but in action. It is ultimately not something to be understood, but something to be experienced. Not something I can give you, but something you must discover for yourself. With this understanding of formlessness established, let us now explore the three-part approach to martial truth that guides the practical implementation of Jeet Kune Do in your daily training. Having explored the concept of formlessness, we now arrive at what I consider the practical methodology of Jeet Kune Do, the three-part approach to discovering martial truth. This approach can be summarized in a single phrase that has become well known, though often imperfectly understood. Absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, add what is specifically your own. These words may seem simple, perhaps even self-evident, yet their proper application requires a depth of understanding and a quality of engagement that transcends casual interpretation. Let me share how this approach emerged from my personal journey and how it can guide your own exploration of martial arts. The first element, absorbing what is useful from any source, represents a radical departure from traditional martial arts thinking. When I began teaching in America, the martial arts landscape was deeply fragmented along stylistic lines. Karate practitioners rarely studied with kung fu masters. Judo players seldom explored boxing. Each tradition maintained its boundaries, often regarding other approaches with suspicion or outright dismissal. My own experience had taught me the limitation of this mindset. In Hong Kong, I had reached the boundaries of Wing Chun, not because Wing Chun was inherently limited, but because any single system, viewed in isolation, cannot address the full spectrum of combat reality. I began to look beyond my primary art, initially with hesitation, later with growing enthusiasm. From Western boxing, I absorbed the fluidity of footwork, the economy of punching mechanics, the tactical sophistication of combination striking. I remember the first time I trained with a professional boxer in Seattle in 1964. His ability to control distance through subtle weight shifts without apparent movement revealed a dimension of positioning I had not fully appreciated. Rather than dismissing this knowledge because it came from outside my tradition, I absorbed it, tested it, integrated elements that proved effective. From fencing, I absorbed concepts of timing and distance that transformed my understanding of combat rhythms. A fencing master in Oakland demonstrated the principle of broken time, the strategic disruption of established rhythms to create openings. This single concept dramatically enhanced my effectiveness across all ranges of combat. From wrestling, I absorbed the reality of ground fighting and the importance of positional control before technical application. Working with a collegiate wrestler in 1967, I experienced how quickly combat could transition to the ground, and how different the tactical landscape became in this domain. This knowledge filled a critical gap in my training. These examples illustrate an approach to learning unconstrained by stylistic boundaries. When you truly absorb what is useful, you make no distinction between their knowledge and your knowledge. You evaluate information based on its effectiveness, rather than its source, its practical application, rather than its traditional authority. But this approach requires more than openness to diverse sources. It demands discernment, the ability to extract principles rather than merely collecting techniques. When I studied different arts, I looked beyond specific movements to understand the underlying concepts that made those movements effective. This principle-based absorption allows for integration rather than accumulation, for synthesis rather than collection. The second element, rejecting what is useless without attachment, proved even more challenging than absorption. We naturally develop attachment to what we have invested time in learning, to what has been validated by authority figures, to what has become familiar through repetition. Rejecting these elements requires a quality of intellectual honesty that many find difficult to maintain. My personal journey of rejection began with aspects of Wing Chun that conflicted with my direct experience. The system's emphasis on centerline control served me well in certain contexts, but became limiting in others. Its relatively stationary stance, effective for close-range engagement, proved vulnerable against mobile opponents who controlled distance. Its limited kicking arsenal left gaps in long-range capabilities. Acknowledging these limitations was painful. I had invested years in mastering this system, had developed identity and pride around my expertise within it. To reject elements of Wing Chun felt, at first, like rejecting a part of myself. This is the psychological barrier that prevents many martial artists from honest evaluation of their training. I remember a specific moment of truth in 1965. I had been practicing a particular trapping sequence for years, a complex series of hand movements designed to control an opponent's arms while striking. In application against non-compliant partners, I discovered that the sequence worked only under specific conditions that rarely manifested in actual combat. The technique was not merely difficult to apply, it was fundamentally misaligned with combat reality as I experienced it. I had two choices. I could modify my understanding of combat to preserve the technique, or I could reject the technique to align with combat reality. Many martial artists unconsciously choose the first option, narrowing their definition of real fighting to scenarios where their techniques work, rather than broadening their techniques to address the full spectrum of fighting. I chose to reject the technique, not with bitterness or wholesale dismissal of the system it came from, but with gratitude for what it had taught me and clear-eyed recognition of its limitations. This rejection wasn't a single decision, but an ongoing process, a continuous refinement through honest testing and evaluation. This process of rejection extends beyond techniques to include training methods, tactical approaches, even philosophical frameworks that don't align with direct experience. When a cherished concept collides with observed reality, reality must take precedence. This sounds obvious, but proves remarkably difficult in practice. particularly within traditions that emphasize deference to established authority. The third element, adding what is specifically your own, transforms martial arts from a process of transmission to one of personalization. This aspect is perhaps the most misunderstood of the three. Many interpret it as inventing new techniques or creating signature moves. While innovation may be part of personal expression, the essence of this element goes deeper. Adding what is specifically your own means, expressing martial arts through the unique matrix of your physical attributes, psychological tendencies, strategic preferences, and lived experiences. No two individuals share identical attributes or experiences, so no two expressions of martial arts should be identical, even within the same system, even when applying the same techniques. My own process of personalization emerged gradually as I recognized my specific attributes. My exceptional speed allowed for timing-based approaches that might not work for someone slower. My philosophical inclination toward directness and simplicity shaped tactical preferences for straightforward rather than elaborate techniques. My background in Wing Chun created natural affinity for certain ranges and positions that became central to my personal expression. I discovered this truth through watching my own students. When I taught the same technique to different individuals, they inevitably expressed it differently. One with longer limbs naturally utilized reach advantages. Another with powerful lower body naturally incorporated stronger base movement. A third, with exceptional reflexes, naturally emphasized counter-attacking opportunities. Initially, I tried to correct these deviations from what I considered proper form. Eventually, I recognized that these weren't deviations, but personalizations. The technique adapting to the individual rather than the individual adapting to the technique. This recognition transformed my teaching approach. Instead of molding students to a standardized ideal, I began helping them discover their own authentic expression within the framework of effective principles. This personalization is not simply accepted, but actively cultivated in Jeet Kune Do. We specifically train to identify your natural attributes, to understand your psychological tendencies, to clarify your strategic preferences, and to align your training with these factors. The question shifts from, am I doing this correctly? To, is this expression aligned with both universal principles and my personal attributes? When you truly add what is specifically your own, your martial arts become not just technically effective, but personally authentic. They express not just combat capability, but individual character. They transcend mere replication to become genuine creation. These three elements, absorption, rejection, and personalization, operate not as sequential steps, but as integrated aspects of a continuous process. You don't first absorb everything, then reject some elements, then personalize what remains. Rather, these functions operate simultaneously, informing and balancing each other throughout your development. Absorption without rejection leads to uncritical accumulation, collecting techniques without discernment, amassing quantity without quality. Rejection without absorption creates rigid limitation, closing yourself to valuable knowledge due to stylistic prejudice or traditional loyalty. Both absorption and rejection without personalization result in technically proficient but inauthentic expression. Martial arts that function, but don't fully embody your unique capabilities and character. When properly integrated, these three elements create what I call a living martial art, an approach that evolves with your experience, adapts to changing circumstances, and expresses your authentic self while remaining grounded in combat effectiveness. It lives because it grows rather than crystallizes. It lives because it responds rather than merely replicates. It lives because it expresses the living individual rather than preserving the petrified past. I experienced this living quality most vividly during the later years of my teaching in Los Angeles. My approach to Jeet Kune Do in 1973 differed significantly from my approach in 1967, which in turn had evolved considerably from my teaching in 1959. This evolution wasn't abandonment of previous understanding, but refinement through continuous absorption, rejection, and personalization. Some observers misinterpreted this evolution as inconsistency or lack of commitment to a defined system. They expected a martial art to be a fixed entity with unchanging techniques and approaches. But this expectation reveals fundamental misunderstanding of what martial arts can and should be. A living entity, whether an organism, an idea, or a martial art, must evolve to remain vital. What doesn't grow stagnates. What doesn't adapt becomes obsolete. The three-part approach ensures this vitality by creating feedback loops between experience and expression, between external knowledge and internal understanding, between universal principles and personal attributes. These feedback loops prevent crystallization into dogma while maintaining connection to foundational effectiveness. In your own practice, implement this approach by first developing awareness of your learning patterns. Do you absorb information uncritically, accepting whatever is taught without testing? Do you reject unfamiliar approaches before truly understanding them? Do you express techniques as instructed, even when they don't align with your attributes? This self-awareness creates the foundation for balanced implementation of the three elements. Then, systematically expand your exposure to diverse approaches. Study different systems not to become a dilettante, but to understand the principles that transcend stylistic boundaries. Test everything you learn through progressive resistance rather than theoretical analysis. Be particularly skeptical of techniques or concepts that cannot be verified through direct experience. Most importantly, develop honest awareness of your own attributes, tendencies, and preferences. This self-knowledge guides effective personalization, not by inventing techniques that express your ego, but by adapting proven principles to align with your authentic capabilities. The goal is not to create a system that is distinctive for its own sake, but to discover an expression that is genuinely yours while remaining fundamentally effective. Remember that this three-part approach is not a philosophy divorced from practice, but a methodology embedded in daily training. Each session should involve some element of absorption, exposure to new information, rejection, critical evaluation of what you practice, and personalization, authentic expression aligned with your attributes. When these elements become habitual, your martial arts naturally evolve into a living expression of both universal principles and personal truth. Now let us explore how this approach manifests through the 4 developmental focuses that structure Jeet Kune Do training. We now come to the practical heart of Jeet Kune Do training. The 4 developmental focuses that transform philosophical understanding into physical reality. While principles and concepts provide the framework for understanding, these 4 areas of development create the actual substance of your martial growth. They answer the essential question: what, specifically, should I develop to embody the principles we have discussed? The first developmental focus is awareness, not simply the act of seeing or hearing, but a quality of perception that transcends ordinary observation and cuts through the filters of expectation. Most people do not truly see what is before them. They see what they expect to see, what they have been conditioned to see, what they want to see. This filtered perception creates a gap between reality and understanding that proves devastating in combat. I discovered the critical importance of unfiltered awareness through a humbling experience early in my development. During a sparring session in Hong Kong, I was repeatedly struck by a technique I believed I was adequately defending against. Frustrated, I asked my partner to show me the movement in slow motion. What I discovered astonished me. I had been defending against what I expected to see, a standard attack from my training, rather than what was actually occurring. My partner had made a subtle modification that my expectations rendered invisible to me. This experience taught me that combat effectiveness begins not with technique, but with perception, the ability to see what is actually happening, rather than what you believe should be happening. In Jeet Kune Do, we develop this unfiltered awareness through specific training methods that deliberately challenge perceptual expectations. One method I call pattern interruption training. In this practice, partners establish familiar patterns of attack and defense, then suddenly break these patterns in unpredictable ways. The objective is not simply to respond to the change, but to notice the moment of change without delay or confusion. This training reveals how easily expectations create perceptual blindness and develops the capacity to see beyond these expectations. Another method involves what I call peripheral combat awareness, the ability to perceive not just what is directly before you, but the entire field of potential action. Most practitioners focus narrowly on immediate threats, creating tunnel vision that renders them vulnerable to secondary attacks or environmental factors. We train to maintain broad awareness, even during intense exchanges, perceiving not just the opponent's weapons, but their entire structure, not just their current movement, but the shifting energy that precedes movement. This expanded awareness extends beyond visual perception to include all senses. We develop what I call whole body listening, the ability to receive information through touch, through spatial relationships, through subtle shifts in energy and intention. This multisensory awareness creates a comprehensive picture of combat reality that transcends any single perceptual channel. The development of true awareness requires systematic removal of perceptual filters. These filters include not just expectations based on training, but psychological patterns, the tendency to see what you fear, to miss what you don't value, to distort what challenges your self-image. True combat awareness requires psychological clarity as much as perceptual acuity. I found that my own perceptual filters often manifested as technical prejudice, the tendency to interpret all movements through the lens of my primary training. When I observed practitioners from unfamiliar styles, I initially saw their techniques as poorly executed versions of what I knew, rather than as distinct approaches with their own integrity. Recognizing and removing this filter dramatically expanded my understanding of combat possibilities. The second developmental focus is sensitivity, the ability to feel energy, intention, and opportunity through direct contact and subtle cues. This sensitivity goes beyond mechanical responsiveness to touch. It involves intuitive understanding of the information conveyed through physical connection and spatial relationship. My journey toward developing this sensitivity began in Wing Chun, through Chi Sao or sticky hands training. Exercises where partners maintain arm contact while attempting to penetrate each other's defenses. Initially, I approached this as a purely mechanical practice, focused on proper angles and positions. Over time, I realized the deeper purpose, developing the ability to feel intention through contact, to sense the gathering of energy before it manifests as movement, to detect openings through direct tactile awareness. This sensitivity evolved far beyond its original context, as I recognized its universal application across all ranges and situations. In punching range, sensitivity manifests as the ability to feel openings in defensive structure. In trapping range, it appears as instantaneous recognition of pressure and direction. In grappling, it emerges as awareness of weight distribution and potential movement before physical shift occurs. We develop this sensitivity through progressive training methods that isolate and challenge specific aspects of perceptual awareness. One such method I call blind sensitivity drilling, where practitioners work with eyes closed, relying entirely on touch and proprioception to navigate combat exchanges. This removes visual dependency, forcing development of tactile intelligence that operates independently of sight. Another method involves what I call pressure testing sensitivity. Exercises where partners apply unpredictable pressure, direction, and timing while maintaining contact. The objective is not to win exchanges, but to develop increasingly subtle perception of what the contact itself reveals about intention and opportunity. I discovered the combat value of this sensitivity during a challenging exchange with a much larger opponent in 1966. Unable to overpower him directly, I found that by maintaining contact and developing acute awareness of his structure, I could detect momentary imbalances imperceptible to visual observation alone. This tactile information allowed for precisely timed applications of minimal force that proved remarkably effective, despite our physical disparity. The third developmental focus is directness, the quality of movement, thought, and strategy that eliminates unnecessary elaboration and achieves objectives through the most efficient path available. This directness is not merely a physical quality, but a comprehensive approach to combat that permeates every aspect of training and application. My journey toward directness began with a critical observation. Under pressure, elaborate techniques tend to collapse. The intricate combinations that work perfectly in cooperative practice often prove unusable in the chaos of actual combat. This recognition led me to systematically analyze my entire technical repertoire with a single question. What is the most direct way to accomplish this objective? This analysis transformed my understanding of effective technique. I discovered that what appears sophisticated in demonstration often proves unnecessarily complex in application. The straight punch proved more reliable than elaborate combinations. Direct kicks outperformed visually impressive but mechanically complex alternatives. Simple trapping movements succeeded where elaborate locking sequences failed. We developed directness through constant refinement, through reducing rather than adding, through simplifying rather than elaborating. One method involves what I call efficiency drilling, where partners progressively reduce movements to their essential components while maintaining or improving effectiveness. A sequence that begins with 5 movements might be refined to 3, then to 2, then to a single integrated action that accomplishes the same purpose with maximum economy. Another approach involves what I call pressure-graduated complexity. In this training, practitioners begin with direct, simple techniques under intensive pressure, adding complexity only when fundamental directness has been mastered, and only to the degree that effectiveness increases rather than decreases. This ensures that elaboration serves function rather than appearance. I experienced the power of directness most vividly when demonstrating with a skilled partner in San Francisco in 1967. We performed 2 versions of a defensive sequence, one with traditional elaboration, another with stripped-down directness. The audience, comprised mostly of traditional martial artists, actually laughed at the simplicity of the direct version, considering it unrefined or incomplete. When we then demonstrated both under genuine pressure, the elaborate sequence consistently failed, while the direct approach succeeded. This concrete demonstration converted many skeptics to the principle of directness. The 4th developmental focus encompasses attributes, the physical and psychological qualities that transform technical understanding into combat capability. These include speed, power, timing, distance control, and psychological attributes like composure under pressure, adaptive thinking, and refined instinct. While techniques are what you do, attributes are the qualities that make techniques effective. My journey toward understanding the critical importance of attributes began with a puzzling observation. Practitioners with seemingly identical technical knowledge often demonstrated dramatically different levels of effectiveness. 2 individuals might perform the same techniques with similar precision in practice, yet one proved consistently superior in application against resistance. What explained this disparity? The answer emerged through careful analysis. Attributes, rather than techniques, determined outcomes in most exchanges. The practitioner with superior speed could execute inferior techniques more effectively than someone with perfect technique but slower execution. The fighter with better timing consistently prevailed over one with more elaborate technical knowledge but less refined timing. This recognition fundamentally shifted my training approach. Rather than focusing primarily on accumulating techniques, I began systematically developing the attributes that make techniques effective. I created specific training methods for each critical attribute, isolated from technique to ensure focused development. For speed, we practice progressive acceleration drills, executing movements first at controlled pace, then at increasing velocity while maintaining precision. For power, we utilize resistance training specifically designed to develop explosive force generation without compromising mechanical efficiency. For timing, we employ rhythm-breaking exercises that develop the ability to perceive and exploit microsecond opportunities. Perhaps most importantly, we train psychological attributes through systematic exposure to pressure. Composure under stress, adaptive decision-making, and instantaneous problem-solving prove more valuable than technical knowledge in actual combat. We create training scenarios specifically designed to develop these mental attributes, gradually increasing pressure to expand capability without creating overwhelming stress that prevents learning. I discovered the supreme importance of attributes during a private exhibition in 1965. A martial artist with impressive technical credentials challenged my approach, claiming his elaborate system was superior to my emphasis on simplicity and directness. In our exchange, his technical knowledge proved irrelevant against attributes I had specifically developed. The speed to close distance before his complex techniques could deploy, the timing to interrupt his preparations, the power to make simplified techniques decisively effective. The fifth and culminating developmental focus is authentic self-expression, the ultimate purpose toward which all other development points. Technical proficiency without personal expression remains hollow imitation rather than genuine mastery. True martial capability emerges when universal principles align with individual nature to create something both effective and authentic. My personal journey towards self-expression began with painful recognition of how deeply I had internalized external expectations. Even as I questioned technical aspects of traditional training, I remained unconsciously bound by traditional metrics of worth, the approval of recognized masters, the validation of established systems, the affirmation of martial arts communities. Breaking free from these external reference points proved more challenging than developing new techniques or approaches. The breakthrough came through a specific realization that my highest moments of effectiveness coincided precisely with my most authentic expression, when what I did aligned completely with who I am. The techniques that worked best for me were not necessarily those considered best in any absolute sense, but those that harmonized with my physical attributes, psychological tendencies, and philosophical orientation. We develop authentic expression through what I call alignment training, systematic exploration of the relationship between techniques and individual attributes. This begins with honest assessment of your natural tendencies, strengths, and limitations. Are you naturally explosive or methodical? Do you prefer direct confrontation or strategic positioning? Are you physically structured for power or speed? These questions reveal your authentic foundation rather than imposing an external ideal. From this foundation, we adapt techniques to enhance rather than override natural tendencies. A practitioner with exceptional reflexes might develop counter-attacking strategies that leverage this attribute. Someone with natural power might emphasize techniques that maximize force transfer. A person with philosophical affinity for efficiency might develop a minimalist approach centered on perfect timing rather than technical elaboration. The ultimate expression appears not as standardized technique, but as individualized movement that manifests both universal principles and personal nature. This isn't simply doing what feels natural. Untrained movement may feel natural but lacks effectiveness. Rather, it is the integration of rigorous development with authentic tendencies to create something both technically sound and personally genuine. I experienced this integration most completely during later exhibitions, where I no longer demonstrated techniques, but simply moved according to my understanding and nature. Observers often asked what style I was showing or what system I followed. The question itself revealed a fundamental misunderstanding. What they witnessed wasn't a style, but an expression, not a system, but an individual embodying principles through authentic movement. These 4 developmental focuses, awareness, sensitivity, directness, and attributes, culminating in authentic self-expression, provide the practical framework for Jeet Kune Do training. They transform philosophical understanding into physical reality, concepts into capabilities, principles into performance. In your own development, approach these areas not as separate domains, but as integrated aspects of unified growth. Awareness informs sensitivity. Sensitivity enables directness. Directness enhances attributes. Attributes facilitate authentic expression. Each reinforces and elevates the others when developed in proper relationship. Begin with honest assessment of your current development in each area. Where are your perceptions filtered by expectation? How sensitive are you to energy and intention through contact? How direct is your approach to technical application? Which attributes require specific development? How authentically do your movements express your nature while maintaining effectiveness? From this assessment, create a balanced development plan that addresses each area systematically. Practice awareness through pattern interruption and peripheral sensitivity training. Develop tactile intelligence through contact exercises with progressive unpredictability. Refine directness through constant questioning of complexity and unnecessary movement. Build attributes through isolated development of specific qualities. Cultivate authentic expression through alignment between techniques and natural tendencies. Remember that this development is not linear but cyclical. Each breakthrough in one area creates new possibilities in others. Improved awareness reveals new opportunities for directness. Enhanced attributes enable more authentic expression. Greater sensitivity refines awareness. This integrated development creates not just better techniques, but a transformed relationship to combat itself. One characterized by clarity, efficiency, capability, and authenticity. This approach to martial development differs fundamentally from traditional progression, which typically focuses on accumulating techniques within stylistic boundaries. In Jeet Kune Do, we develop qualities that transcend specific techniques, capabilities that remain effective, regardless of stylistic context, attributes that serve any technical expression. This creates not just a different way of fighting, but a different way of understanding and experiencing combat itself. When these developmental focuses reach maturity, they create what I call the quality of no quality. Movement so natural it appears without method. Effectiveness so integrated it seems without effort. Expression so authentic it transcends categorization. This is not the beginning of development, but its culmination. The point where extensive training becomes invisible while its effects remain fully present. This culmination is not a fixed destination, but an ongoing evolution, a continuous refinement that responds to changing circumstances, new understandings, and developing capabilities. The 4 developmental focuses provide not a finished product, but a living process, not an end point, but a journey of perpetual growth. As we reach the culmination of our exploration of Jeet Kune Do, we must address the fundamental question that underlies everything we have discussed. What is the ultimate purpose of martial arts training? This question extends far beyond techniques and strategies into the realm of life philosophy itself. Many begin their martial journey seeking to collect techniques, to accumulate a catalogue of responses, to master an impressive repertoire of movements, to acquire deadly secrets that others do not possess. This approach views martial arts as primarily an acquisition of skills, a gathering of assets, a collection of capabilities. There is nothing inherently wrong with developing technical proficiency. Indeed, it forms a necessary foundation. But if your martial arts training ends with technical collection, it remains fundamentally incomplete. The true purpose of Jeet Kune Do, and I would argue of all genuine martial arts, is self-discovery. Each technique you learn, each principle you understand, Each attribute you develop serves as a mirror reflecting aspects of yourself that might otherwise remain hidden. The way you move, the strategies you favor, the responses you generate under pressure, these reveal not just your fighting capabilities, but your essential nature. I discovered this truth through my own evolution. When I began teaching in America, I still approached martial arts primarily as technical transmission, sharing what I knew with those who wanted to learn. I was, in essence, helping others collect techniques, albeit more effective ones than were commonly available. But as my understanding deepened, I recognized that my greatest contribution wasn't teaching specific movements, but facilitating a process of discovery through which each person could find their own martial truth. This shift transformed not just what I taught, but how I taught. Rather than molding students to a predetermined ideal, I began creating conditions that allowed them to discover their authentic expression. Rather than providing answers, I began asking questions that led to personal insights. Rather than imposing my way, I began helping each person find their way. The distinction between these approaches is profound. Technical collection creates dependency, reliance on external authority for validation and guidance. Self-discovery creates liberation, the development of internal reference points that function independently of external validation. The first approach can create excellent practitioners. The second creates genuine artists, individuals whose expression flows from internal understanding rather than external imitation. Finding personal truth requires direct experience, the willingness to test, to fail, to learn, to refine through actual practice rather than theoretical understanding. Many martial artists mistake intellectual comprehension for genuine knowledge. They believe that because they can explain a concept, they have truly integrated it. But real understanding comes only through embodied experience, through feeling rather than thinking, through doing rather than analyzing. I encountered this distinction dramatically during my recovery from a serious back injury in 1970. Unable to train physically for months, I devoted myself to theoretical analysis of movement principles, tactical approaches, and combat dynamics. When I finally returned to physical training, I discovered something surprising. Despite my deepened theoretical understanding, my actual performance had declined. The knowledge in my mind had not translated to wisdom in my body. Only through renewed physical practice, through direct, embodied experience, could I reintegrate intellectual understanding with physical expression. This revelation confirmed what I had increasingly suspected, that martial truth cannot be merely transmitted from teacher to student, but must be discovered anew by each practitioner through their own experience. No matter how precisely I explain a principle, no matter how carefully I demonstrate a technique, no matter how thoroughly I analyze a concept, my understanding remains mine. You must forge your own understanding through your own experience. This doesn't mean teachers are unnecessary. They serve vital functions, creating structured conditions for learning, pointing attention toward relevant aspects of experience, providing feedback that accelerates development. But the best teachers recognize that their role is not to clone themselves, but to catalyze discovery, to help each person find their unique expression of universal principles. When you achieve this personal understanding through direct experience, it brings a quality of liberation that cannot be attained through other means. You no longer move according to external dictates, but according to internal understanding. You no longer fight according to memorized patterns, but according to perceived reality. You no longer measure your progress against external standards, but against your own evolving capabilities. This liberation manifests as freedom from artificial constraints. You are no longer bound by stylistic limitations, by technical preferences, by traditional approaches. But more importantly, it creates freedom toward authentic expression. The ability to manifest your understanding in ways that align perfectly with your nature, while remaining effective within the reality of combat. I experienced this freedom most completely during later demonstrations, where I no longer thought about what to show or how to move. I simply expressed my understanding through movement that arose naturally from the integration of principle and personality. Observers often commented on the unusual quality of these demonstrations, not just their technical effectiveness, but their sense of unforced naturalness, of movement that seemed simultaneously spontaneous and precisely calibrated. This quality of liberation extends beyond martial arts into all dimensions of living. The same principles that free your physical expression can liberate your thinking, your emotional responses, your creative endeavors, your relationships. The capacity to perceive without filtering, to respond without hesitation, to adapt without resistance, to express without artifice. These qualities enhance not just combat effectiveness, but life effectiveness. Here we discover the deepest value of martial arts training. It provides a laboratory for developing qualities that serve all aspects of human experience. The attributes that make you effective in combat: present moment awareness, adaptability, economy of action, congruence between intention and expression, create effectiveness in any domain where you apply them. I found that my martial development directly enhanced my acting, my writing, my teaching, my personal interactions. The quality of presence I cultivated through combat awareness translated to more authentic performances. The directness I developed through technique refinement created more impactful communication. The honest self-expression I discovered through martial exploration manifested as greater authenticity in all my endeavors. This transfer occurs because the fundamental challenges of combat parallel the fundamental challenges of living. Both require navigating uncertainty, managing energy, responding to resistance, maintaining awareness under pressure, expressing intention through action. The qualities you develop to address these challenges in combat naturally extend to addressing similar challenges in other contexts. Consider how the principle of adaptability serves both fighting and living. In combat, adaptability allows you to respond effectively to unexpected attacks, to changing circumstances, to unfamiliar strategies. In life, this same quality enables you to navigate changing relationships, career shifts, unexpected obstacles, new opportunities. The adaptability you develop through martial training becomes a life resource applicable far beyond fighting. Similarly, the economy of motion that enhances combat effectiveness translates directly to efficiency in other domains. Learning to accomplish objectives with minimal energy expenditure, to eliminate unnecessary movement, to focus resources precisely where needed. These capacities serve professional projects, personal goals, creative endeavors, daily tasks. What begins as physical economy naturally extends to psychological and practical economy. The most profound transfer occurs with self-knowledge. Martial arts training, when approached as self-discovery rather than technique collection, reveals aspects of yourself that might otherwise remain hidden. How do you respond under pressure? What are your default reactions to threat? Where do you hold tension? When do you hesitate? What triggers reactivity rather than responsiveness? These insights illuminate not just your fighting tendencies, but your living tendencies. With this understanding, martial arts becomes not merely a method of fighting, but a vehicle for self-realization, a path toward understanding your essential nature and expressing it authentically in all dimensions of experience. This doesn't elevate martial arts above other developmental paths, but recognizes its potential depth when approached with appropriate understanding. Many practitioners never reach this depth because they remain focused on external development, on techniques, on rankings, on competitions, on comparisons with others. They develop fighting capability but miss the deeper opportunity for self-understanding. Others bypass the necessary technical foundation and attempt to move directly to philosophical abstraction, developing concepts without capabilities, theories without embodiment. Both approaches fall short of the integrated development that true martial arts offers. The middle path, developing technical proficiency as a foundation for self-discovery, using external forms as vehicles for internal understanding, balancing skill acquisition with personal exploration, creates the conditions for genuine mastery. This mastery manifests not just in fighting effectiveness, but in living effectiveness, in the ability to navigate all aspects of experience with awareness, adaptability, economy, and authentic expression. As you continue your martial journey, remember that each technique you learn, each drill you practice, each exchange you engage in, offers two simultaneous opportunities: to develop combat capability and to discover yourself. The first, without the second, creates a fighter without depth. The second, without the first, creates a philosopher without substance. Together, they forge a martial artist in the truest sense, someone whose technical proficiency serves as a vehicle for personal truth, whose external development reflects internal understanding. This integration represents the highest potential of martial arts training, not merely to make you dangerous, but to make you whole, not just to teach you fighting, but to help you discover living. When approached with this understanding, Jeet Kune Do becomes not simply a method of combat, but a pathway to self-realization, not merely a fighting system, but a vehicle for authentic expression in all dimensions of experience. My final insight is this: the ultimate purpose of Jeet Kune Do is to render itself unnecessary. When you fully integrate its principles, you no longer need a system, a method, a style. You simply express your understanding directly through movement appropriate to the moment. The form dissolves while the essence remains. The path disappears while the journey continues. The teaching fades while the truth endures. This dissolution represents not failure but fulfillment, the point where external guidance gives way to internal wisdom, where structured development yields to natural expression, where the art transcends itself to become simply life, lived with awareness, efficiency, adaptability, and authenticity. This is the philosophical culmination of Jeet Kune Do. Not a final destination, but a continuing evolution. Not an ultimate answer, but an ever-deepening question. Not a fixed truth, but a living exploration of what it means to be fully human. I share these insights not as definitive conclusions, but as reflections from my own journey. A journey that continues with each moment, each breath, each movement, each exchange. Take what resonates with your experience. Question what doesn't align with your understanding. Test everything against the reality you encounter. And above all, discover your own truth through direct experience rather than accepting mine or anyone else's as final authority. For in the end, the highest teaching I can offer is this. Be water, my friend, fluid yet powerful, yielding yet penetrating, formless yet effective, ever-changing yet true to your nature. This is the essence of Jeet Kune Do. This is the heart of martial arts. This is the way of authentic living. As our time together draws to a close, I wish to speak directly to you. Not as a teacher addressing a student, not as a master instructing a disciple, but as one human being sharing with another the insights gathered along a path of continuous discovery. Your journey in martial arts, whether you have just taken your first steps or have walked this path for decades, is uniquely yours. No one can walk it for you. No one can discover your truths for you. No one can express your understanding for you. This may seem like a burden, this responsibility for your own development. But it is actually the greatest gift that martial arts offers. The opportunity to discover yourself through direct experience. Many will tell you they have found the perfect system, the ultimate technique, the superior approach. They will invite you to follow their way, to adopt their understanding, to practice their methods. Listen to them. Learn from them. Take what proves valuable in your experience, but never surrender your own journey to another's certainty. For the moment you accept someone else's truth as definitive, your own exploration ends. I encourage you to approach your training with both discipline and freedom. The discipline to develop fundamental skills through consistent practice, and the freedom to question everything, including what I have shared with you today. Test principles against your experience, verify concepts through your practice, confirm theories through your application. This testing, this verification, this confirmation through direct experience transforms second-hand information into first-hand knowledge. Remember that techniques are not ends in themselves, but means for developing understanding. Do not measure your progress by how many movements you have mastered, but by how deeply you have penetrated to the principles that underlie all movement. A practitioner who knows 1,000 techniques without understanding their essence remains a beginner. A practitioner who fully embodies a single principle through direct experience has entered the path of mastery. In your training, honor both tradition and innovation. Tradition for the accumulated wisdom it offers, and innovation for the fresh insights it provides. Neither reverence for the past nor fascination with the new alone creates the optimal condition for growth. It is the creative tension between preservation and exploration, between structure and freedom, between form and formlessness, that generates the most fertile ground for development. As you progress, you will inevitably encounter plateaus, periods where visible improvement seems to halt, where enthusiasm wanes, where doubts arise. Know that these plateaus are not obstacles to your development, but essential aspects of it. They are integrative phases where external progress pauses, so that internal assimilation can occur. The seed appears dormant, precisely when the most important growth, the development of roots, is taking place beneath the surface. During these plateaus, resist the temptation to abandon your path for a seemingly easier one. Resist the urge to accumulate more techniques, when you have not yet embodied those you already know. Resist the pull toward complexity when simplicity has not yet revealed its depths. Instead, return to fundamentals with renewed attention, bringing your expanded awareness to basic movements. You will discover that what appeared simple at the beginning now reveals layers of subtlety previously invisible to you. Throughout your journey, remember that martial arts training develops not just physical capabilities, but the whole being. The qualities you cultivate in practice, awareness, responsiveness, efficiency, adaptability, extend naturally to all dimensions of living when you recognize their universal application. Your training hall becomes a laboratory for developing attributes that serve you in every environment, in every relationship, in every endeavor. Let me share with you a final insight that has emerged from my own exploration. The ultimate freedom comes not from expanding options, but from eliminating resistance. Most practitioners focus on developing more techniques, more strategies, more approaches, constantly expanding their repertoire of possible actions. This expansion has value, but it addresses only half of the equation. True liberation comes when you eliminate internal resistance to what is actually occurring. This resistance takes many forms. The expectation that an encounter should unfold differently, the attachment to techniques you have perfected, the desire to control what cannot be controlled, the hesitation born of fear or doubt. When these forms of resistance dissolve, what remains is not emptiness, but pure responsiveness, the capacity to meet each moment completely, to adapt instantly to changing circumstances, to express your understanding without the friction of expectation or hesitation. I discovered this truth not through philosophical contemplation, but through direct experience in combat. In my most effective moments, I found that success came not from imposing my will, but from eliminating anything that interfered with natural response. Not from trying harder, but from releasing unnecessary effort. Not from calculating the perfect technique, but from allowing appropriate action to emerge from complete presence. This state, where resistance dissolves and response flows naturally from perception, represents the convergence of the external and internal aspects of martial arts. The technical foundation you develop through disciplined practice merges with the psychological freedom you cultivate through awareness training. The result is action that is simultaneously structured and spontaneous, powerful and effortless, intentional and natural. This convergence creates what the Zen tradition calls mushin, or no mind, a condition where the separation between thinker and thought, between perceiver and perception, between actor and action, momentarily dissolves. In this state, you do not perform techniques. Response simply occurs through you. You do not apply strategies. Appropriate action emerges naturally. You do not control the situation. You become the situation, expressing itself through your trained capabilities. I have experienced this state not just in martial arts, but in other dimensions of expression, in acting, in writing, in teaching, in conversation. The conditions that produce it remain constant across contexts. Complete presence, eliminated resistance, integrated understanding, authentic expression. This consistency reveals that what we discover through martial arts training is not merely a specialized capability, but a universal quality of optimal human functioning. As you continue your journey, I invite you to consider martial arts not just as training for combat, but as a vehicle for discovering this quality of integrated presence in all aspects of living. The self-defense you develop extends beyond physical protection to include defense against internal enemies, against the distractions that fragment attention, the tensions that restrict movement, the expectations that distort perception, the fears that limit expression. In closing, let me leave you with this. Water does not seek to overcome obstacles through force. It simply finds the natural path around, through, under, or over whatever it encounters. It does not resist gravity. It flows with it. It does not maintain fixed shape. It adapts perfectly to each container. It does not lose its essential nature regardless of external circumstances. You already possess this quality of water within you. It is not something to be acquired, but something to be uncovered, revealed as you eliminate the tensions, expectations, and limitations that prevent its natural expression. Your training is not about becoming something other than yourself, but about discovering what you have always been beneath accumulated layers of conditioning and reaction. This is the heart of Jeet Kune Do, not a style to be mastered, but an exploration to be lived. Not a destination to be reached, but a journey to be experienced. Not my truth to be adopted, but your truth to be discovered. Go forward in your practice with both discipline and freedom, with both structure and spontaneity, with both technical development and philosophical inquiry. Remember that the purpose of all technique, all training, all teaching is ultimately self-liberation. Freedom from artificial constraints and freedom toward authentic expression. Be water, my friend. Not as a poetic metaphor, but as a lived reality. Flow through the circumstances of your life with the same adaptability, the same directness, the same unstoppable persistence that water demonstrates. Maintain your essential nature while taking the shape of each moment you encounter. Find the natural path forward, not through force, but through perfect alignment with what is. In this fluidity, you will discover not just effectiveness in combat, but effectiveness in living. You will find not just the means to protect yourself, but the capacity to express yourself fully. You will develop not just martial capability, but human potential. This is my wish for you. This is my encouragement for your journey. This is the promise of martial arts approached not merely as fighting technique, but as living practice. Thank you for walking this path with me today. The words are now finished, but the exploration continues with every breath, every movement, every moment of your life. Train diligently, question continuously, discover yourself, express authentically, and above all, flow like water through the journey that awaits you.